Section 1. The World Behind the Screen. There is something strange about Quahog, Rhode Island. Not the kind of strange that you can put your finger on right away. Not the kind that announces itself with dramatic music or a sudden flash of lightning across a darkened sky. It is a quieter kind of strange. The kind that settles in slowly, like fog drifting off the water and into the streets late at night, curling around the lampposts and swallowing the sidewalks, making the whole neighborhood feel slightly different from how it looked in the daylight. You might not notice it at first. You might watch the show for years before something snags in the back of your mind. Some detail that does not quite line up, some question that gets raised and then quietly dropped, some thread left dangling at the end of an episode that nobody ever picks back up. And once you start pulling on those threads, you find that there are hundreds of them. This is a show that ran for over 2 decades and counting. Across more than 400 episodes, the writers built something enormous and intricate, a fictional world full of recurring characters, inside jokes, mythologies, contradictions, and genuine puzzles that have never been given clean, satisfying answers. Some of those puzzles were created intentionally. The writers knew exactly what they were doing when they dropped certain details, knowing that fans would obsess over them for years. Other mysteries seem to have arrived by accident, born from the chaos of a long-running writer's room where continuity is fluid, where a joke from Season 3 might quietly contradict something established in Season 9, and where the rules of the universe are bent, broken, and sometimes completely ignored whenever the story requires it. And yet, somehow those mysteries make the show richer. There is something deeply pleasurable about sitting with a question that has no clean answer, about turning over a piece of lore in your mind and watching the light catch it from different angles. That is what this is. A slow, careful walk through some of the deepest, most enduring, most genuinely fascinating mysteries that Family Guy has given us over its long life on television. Some of these have been half addressed by the writers over the years. Others remain completely open. A few of them might not even have answers, might simply be the natural byproduct of a creative team that was moving too fast to tie every loose end into a bow. But that is fine. That is more than fine, actually. Some questions are better when they stay questions. Some doors are more interesting to stand in front of than to walk through. So settle in. Get comfortable. The night is long, and there is a lot of ground to cover. We are going to start at the very beginning, with the question that Seth MacFarlane himself once called the single most asked question about the show. The mystery of the 1-year-old who speaks like a villain from a gothic novel. The baby in the Griffin house whose voice carries an English accent sharp enough to cut glass, and nobody, not even the people who live with him every single day, seems to be quite sure whether they can actually hear him. Before we go any further, if you are listening to this right now, drop a comment and let me know where you are and what time it is wherever you are. I love knowing that people are falling asleep to this all across the world. And if you have not subscribed yet, please consider doing that. It genuinely helps and it means you will never miss a new upload. Section 2. The Stewie Problem? Who can actually hear him? Picture the scene. It is an ordinary evening in the Griffin household. Peter is slumped on the couch with a beer sweating rings onto the armrest. Lois is in the kitchen. Meg is somewhere upstairs, probably behind a closed door. Chris is watching television with that particular blank expression that is entirely his own. And in the living room? Or perhaps in his crib upstairs? Or perhaps standing right there in the middle of the kitchen floor is Stewie, 1 year old. Round head, red overalls, tiny sneakers, and he is delivering a speech. A long, considered, articulate speech with subordinate clauses and references to geopolitical theory and a vocabulary that most adults would be embarrassed not to know. He is plotting something. He is explaining something. He is making a declaration that would be, in any rational universe, completely impossible for a baby to make. And the question that hangs in the air above every single one of those scenes, unanswered across hundreds of episodes spanning decades of television, is deceptively simple. Can they hear him? It sounds like a question with an obvious answer. Of course they cannot hear him. He is a baby. The whole joke is that he is a baby secretly running the world domination operations of a criminal mastermind, and the people around him are completely oblivious to it. That is the bit, that is the gag. Except it is not that simple, because the show itself has never been consistent about it. Not once, not even close. And the inconsistency is so thoroughgoing, so persistent across so many seasons, that it has stopped feeling like an oversight and started feeling like something more deliberate. Something almost architectural, Like the writers built ambiguity directly into the foundation of the character and decided never to resolve it, because the unresolved version is infinitely more interesting than any clean answer could be. Let us start with what we know for certain. Brian can always understand Stewie. That is the one firm, non-negotiable rule that the show has held to with something approaching real consistency. Wherever else the writers have been loose and fluid, the Brian-Stewie communication channel has remained open. They talk to each other constantly in real dialogue, with back and forth and arguments and jokes and emotional conversations that require both participants to understand exactly what the other one is saying. Brian does not just sort of get the gist of Stewie's meaning. He hears him precisely, responds to specifics, pushes back on particular words, and catches every ironic inflection. Their relationship is built entirely on the premise that this communication works perfectly. But here is where it gets interesting. Brian being the only character who can reliably understand Stewie is itself a mystery, not a resolution of one. Why Brian? What is it about a dog, specifically a dog who is already doing things that defy the laws of biology and nature, that makes him uniquely capable of hearing a baby's full speech? The show has floated one explanation, very quietly, almost as a throwaway, which is that in one early episode Brian briefly appears to hear Stewie's thoughts. Not his words, his thoughts. Which opens a door that the show immediately closed again and never revisited. If Brian has some kind of telepathic connection to Stewie's mind, that is a much larger and stranger thing than simply having good ears. But the show let that detail drift away like smoke and moved on. Then there is the inconsistency with everyone else. Seth MacFarlane, when pressed about this question during interviews and panel appearances, has given two different answers at different times. In one interview, speaking to a DVD fan site, he said that everyone in the show can hear and understand Stewie, but because he is a toddler, they simply do not take what he says seriously. Adults dismiss him the way adults dismiss children, not because they cannot understand him, but because the world conditions us to treat babies as incapable of meaning what they say. On that reading, every scene where a character ignores something Stewie has just said is not a scene where they failed to understand him. It is a scene where they heard him perfectly and chose to respond with the particular selective deafness that adults apply to children. That is actually a fairly brilliant interpretation, and it maps onto something real. The way we hear small children is shaped by our assumptions about what they are capable of saying. A parent who hears their toddler babble a sound that could be a word and could be noise defaults to noise, not because of anything wrong with their ears, but because of what they believe a toddler is capable of. If everyone in the Griffin household fundamentally cannot believe that Stewie is really saying what he appears to be saying, then ignoring him is not a failure of perception. It is a failure of imagination. But then McFarland gave a different answer at Comic-Con in 2011. In that setting, he said that Brian always understands Stewie, Chris occasionally understands him, and that Peter, Lois, and Meg generally do not. And he acknowledged that the writers break these rules whenever a joke requires it, which is about as close to an official non-answer as you can get. The rule is that there is no rule. The rule is whatever serves the comedy in a given moment. And yet, looking at the episodes themselves, the evidence does not fit neatly into either framework. There are dozens of moments where characters who supposedly cannot understand Stewie very clearly respond to exactly what he has said. There is the moment in an early episode where Lois responds to something specific Stewie said, something specific enough that a vague general awareness of his tone would not explain it. There are exchanges with Peter that require him to have registered at least the surface content of Stewie's words. There are moments with Meg, with Joe, with random strangers in stores and restaurants, where the response is too precise to be coincidence or improvised parental intuition. And then the very next scene, the same character will ignore Stewie entirely while he delivers a monologue that would get him arrested if anyone with any authority could hear it. The most metatextual acknowledgement of this confusion came in the episode where Hank Hill, in a dream sequence, wakes up from a dream where he was Peter Griffin and says, with his characteristic flat earnestness, that he always wakes up before he finds out whether they can understand the baby. The writers were not just winking at the audience there. They were essentially admitting that even they do not know, or at least that they have made a deliberate creative choice to keep the question alive and unanswered. The ambiguity is the point. The uncertainty is a feature, not a bug. Then came an episode in season 19 called Stewie's First Word. This was marketed as the episode that would finally resolve everything. The episode where, for the first time in the show's history, the entire world would hear Stewie speak a real word. And what happens in that episode is revealing, because even in the episode designed to answer the question, the writers managed to deliver an explanation that explains almost nothing while still feeling satisfying in the moment. Stewie yells a profanity loudly enough that everyone in the vicinity hears it clearly, and his theory for why this happened is that he was feeling such intense emotion in that moment that the word simply burst through whatever barrier normally keeps him from being heard. Which means the explanation is not that he cannot normally be heard, and not that he can always be heard, but that it is some function of emotional intensity and perhaps frequency or volume or some other variable that remains completely undefined. He broke through in that moment because he meant it with everything he had. What that means for every other moment in the show's history is left deliberately for the viewer to figure out. There is a fan theory that has circulated for years, and that actually does a better job than any official answer at making sense of the inconsistency. The theory is that the entire show is being narrated from Stewie's perspective, that what we are watching is not objective reality, but a baby's subjective experience of the world, filtered through the cognitive and emotional framework of an infant genius. On this reading, the characters around Stewie do not hear him as we hear him, because that articulate, British accented voice is Stewie's internal experience of his own communication, not a literal transcription of sounds he is making. He experiences himself as fully eloquent. The adults in his world experience him as a baby making baby sounds. The moments where characters respond to him are the moments where, in his subjective experience, he felt understood, whether or not that understanding was real or imagined. Brian, on this reading, does not have magical hearing. Brian is simply the character with whom Stewie feels most genuinely heard, and the show renders that emotional reality as literal comprehension. It is a beautiful theory. It does not solve the mystery, exactly, but it reframes it in a way that makes the ambiguity feel like something with meaning, rather than simply a continuity error that accumulated over hundreds of episodes. Then there is the layer of the mystery that almost nobody talks about, which is Stewie's accent. In the Season 11 episode Send In Stewie Please, where Stewie is sent to speak with a school counselor after pushing a classmate down some stairs, he reveals something that most viewers found genuinely surprising. The British accent is fake. He admits, in a moment of unusual vulnerability, that he does not actually sound the way the audience has always heard him. His real voice, he tells the counselor, sounds much more like Peter. The accent is what he calls an affectation, armor that he wears to get through the day, a persona he cultivated to feel special. When the counselor tells him that without the accent he would just be like everyone else, Stewie puts it back on immediately, because the alternative is being ordinary. And here is the thing about that revelation. If the British accent is a performance, a conscious affectation, then the voice we have been hearing for the entire run of the show is Stewie's chosen version of himself, not his authentic vocal sound. And that raises the question of when exactly the accent began. Who hears the accent versus who hears the underlying voice beneath it, and whether the people who respond to him in some episodes are responding to the performance or to the raw sound of a baby making noises that feel meaningful from the inside. The counselor in that episode hears both versions, and the show plays it as comedy, with both voices sounding identical to everyone but Stewie, because from the outside, a baby is a baby regardless of the accent. So here is where we land after all of that. After decades of episodes and 2 different official answers from the creator himself and 1 episode specifically designed to resolve things, we still do not know. Not really. We know that Brian can hear him. We know that the show breaks its own rules constantly. We know that the Season 19 explanation involves emotion as a variable. We know that the accent is a performance. We know that the writers find the ambiguity more valuable than a clean answer. And perhaps that is exactly right. The mystery of who can hear Stewie is not really a question about acoustics or biology. It is a question about childhood and communication, and the gap between what a person means and what the world receives. Children know things adults cannot imagine. They feel things adults have learned to suppress. They see things adults have taught themselves not to notice. And most of the time, the adults around them are not listening. Not because they cannot hear, because they have decided, before the words even arrive, that there is nothing there worth listening to. Stewie is 1 year old, and he understands all of this perfectly. That is the real joke, and it is not funny at all. Section 3. What exactly is Brian Griffin? He drives a Prius. He drinks dry martinis at the kitchen counter, usually around 2 in the afternoon, with the particular practiced ease of someone who has done it so many times that it no longer even registers as a choice. He walks on 2 legs. He talks to people at parties, discusses novels, holds opinions about political theory, dates women, tries and mostly fails to write the great American novel he has been not finishing for as long as anyone can remember. He files his taxes, he sees a therapist, he feels guilt and longing and inadequacy and love of a particular complicated kind that most adult humans would recognize immediately and most animals would not feel at all. He is also, without question, a dog. Not metaphorically, not in the sense that some people are described as dogs in a way that implies something about their character. Brian Edward Griffin is a white Labrador retriever who was born in Austin, Texas, in a litter of 5, to a mother named Biscuit and a father named Coco, on a farm, with no indication that anything unusual was happening. He spent time as a homeless stray in the town of Quahog, washing car windshields for change before Peter encountered him and offered him a home. He cleans himself with his tongue. He chases his own tail when he gets excited. He has been shown, in one episode, confirming that he sees in black and white. He is afraid of the vacuum cleaner. He cannot entirely control certain biological impulses when presented with a purebred show dog. At a veterinary level, at a biological level, at every level that biology has any claim on, Brian Griffin is a dog. And yet he is also obviously not simply a dog. He is something else. Something that the show has never bothered to define, has never felt any obligation to explain, and treats with the particular confidence that great world-building often displays, which is the confidence of a story that knows its own rules even if it never states them out loud. Brian exists. He is what he is. The narrative moves forward, and we move with it. But the question of what Brian actually is, what mechanism or circumstance produced a Labrador retriever who is functionally more human than most humans the show depicts, is one of the genuinely compelling unsolved puzzles of the series. And unlike the Stewie question, which the show has at least gestured toward addressing, the Brian question has been met with near total silence from the writers and the creator. He just is. That is the answer. He just is. That silence has, predictably, produced a rich ecosystem of fan theories, and some of them are more interesting than others. The most widely circulated theory, the one that has made the rounds on various forums and content sites, suggests that Brian is some kind of scientific or governmental experiment. The theory draws a connecting line between the Family Guy universe and the American Dad universe, both created by Seth MacFarlane, both set in a world where the CIA routinely does things to living creatures that science has no business doing. In American Dad, there is a character named Roger who is an alien living in the attic of the Smith family. And there is Klaus, the goldfish with a human brain, who came to have a fish body because the CIA put him there. The CIA in the McFarland universe is not a normal government agency. It is an organization that treats the boundaries of biology as suggestions. The theory proposes that Brian is a product of the same kind of thinking, specifically a genetic engineering project designed to produce a creature with human-level intelligence that could function as some kind of observer or operative or living experiment. The dog body would be a feature, not a limitation, because a dog can go places a human cannot, can be introduced to a family without triggering the kind of questions that a human stranger would, and can operate under a social cover that nobody would ever think to interrogate. A talking dog is impossible, so it never occurs to anyone to wonder whether the dog is a spy. It is a good theory. It is maybe too tidy, and the show has never validated it with any actual evidence within the narrative, but it has a certain explanatory elegance. It answers the question of how without needing to engage too deeply with the more uncomfortable version of the question, which is what? Because the more you look at Brian, the more the question of what he is opens onto something stranger than a government experiment. The show is very deliberate about never explaining his inner life, and yet it offers glimpses of it that are extraordinary in their implications. Brian keeps a handgun in a safety deposit box, and when Stewie asks him why, he gives an answer that is raw and honest and devastating, that there are days when he cannot rule out needing it for himself, that the weight of his existence sometimes becomes more than he knows what to do with. That is an answer that speaks to a kind of consciousness that no animal, however intelligent, should be able to articulate. That is an answer from a being who has a full inner life, who experiences despair, who understands mortality not as an abstract concept but as something personal and present and heavy. Brian has been in therapy. He has been on antidepressants. He has had his heart broken, genuinely, in the way that produces the specific kind of dull ache that takes months to stop. He has been in love, in a way that goes beyond the hormonal machinery of any animal, into territory that requires something like a soul to navigate. He has written things, or tried to, with the specific agony of someone who knows exactly how good writing can be and cannot reliably produce it himself, and that gap between vision and execution is one of the most human experiences that exists. None of this is explained. The show never says where it came from. It just presents Brian as fully dimensional and moves on. There is a simpler reading, which is that Brian is a stand-in for a specific kind of human being. He was modeled, loosely, on Seth MacFarlane's own sensibility, and more specifically on a certain type of creative, liberal, somewhat tortured intellectual who is always more comfortable with ideas than with the practical business of living. The aspiring writer who cannot finish his novel. The person who has strong opinions about everything and accomplishes less than those opinions suggest he should. The romantic who idealizes love and consistently finds himself in situations that fall short of the ideal. The friend who is genuinely kind and genuinely intelligent and somehow still manages to make a mess of things on a regular basis. On that reading, Brian is not a mystery to be solved. He is a portrait. He is MacFarlane working something out on the page, using the convenient metaphor of a talking dog to create a little distance between the portrait and the artist. The inexplicability of his existence is not a puzzle. It is a framing device. The fact that he is technically a Labrador is what allows the show to do things with his character that it could not do with a human character, including having him die and come back, having him exist in multiple alternate universe versions, having him age at a different rate than the humans around him, and having him be simultaneously inside and outside the family dynamic in a way that a human character could never manage. But even accepting that reading, even accepting Brian as metaphor and portrait rather than literal mystery, there are questions that linger. The show established, in a relatively early episode, that the Griffin family had a previous dog before Brian, a dog named Todd, who was put down at the age of 15 due to illness. Todd was, by every indication, a normal dog. He did not talk. He did not drive. He did not have opinions about literature or relationships or the direction of the country. He was a dog. And then Peter finds Brian on the street and brings him home, and Brian slots into the family with a smoothness that nobody ever questions. Peter never stops to wonder why this dog is different from every other dog he has ever encountered. Lois never seems particularly surprised. The kids accept it. Even the neighbors accept it, even the people at the bar, even the various authority figures and institutions that Brian interacts with over the years. In a world where dogs do not normally talk, a talking dog should be extraordinary. And in the early seasons, the show does sometimes play this for comedy, moments where someone will do a double take or react with surprise to something Brian has said or done, but those reactions are inconsistent. Most of the time, the world treats Brian as a slightly unusual but fundamentally comprehensible thing, the way it treats Stewie actually, which is to say, with a selective ignorance that the narrative never fully explains. The Labrador breed choice is interesting in itself. Labs are the most popular dog breed in the United States, which is part of why the choice was made. They are warm, loyal, sociable, a little goofy, capable of extraordinary loyalty to the people they love. They are bred to be good companions. Brian has all of those qualities, and also their shadow versions. The loyalty that tips into enabling, the sociability that masks real loneliness, the warmth that is sometimes used to deflect from genuine intimacy. He is a lab the way complicated people are sometimes a specific type that they have grown into and beyond at the same time. And then there is his age. Brian has been described as 10 years old at various points in the show, which in dog years is somewhere in the range of 70 human years. In other episodes, his age seems to reset or drift. His aging has never been addressed systematically or with any consistency, and the show does not appear to be tracking it. He ages and does not age, in the same floating way that the human characters do, where the children are perpetually teenagers and Peter is perpetually 40-something regardless of how much time the narrative implies has passed. For a character who thinks so much about mortality, about the nature of his own existence, about what it means to be a dog who has lived a human life, this indifference to his own aging is quietly poignant. He knows his natural lifespan is shorter than the humans he loves. He has mentioned it. He has had entire conversations about it. But the show keeps him walking, talking, ordering martinis, failing to finish his novel, as if the accounting of years has nothing to do with him. What is Brian Griffin? He is the character who should not exist, in a world that has decided not to ask why he does. And maybe that is the most honest answer the show could give. Some questions resist the kind of answer that makes them go away. Brian is one of them. Section 4. The Quagmire Enigma. What is he hiding? Glenn Quagmire is 61 years old. That is not a guess or an estimate. It is information that the show provides directly during an episode where his birthday is celebrated and his age is confirmed. He is 61 years old, which means he was born in approximately 1948, which means he grew up through the 1950s and 60s, was a young man during the Vietnam War era, and has been alive for a period of time that should make him a genuinely historical figure relative to the other characters in the show. And yet he does not look 61. He has never looked 61. He has one of those faces that the show draws as ageless, smooth and frozen in the particular way that cartoon characters can be, neither young nor old, but simply Quagmire, a fixed point in the visual grammar of the series. His face has not aged between Season 1 and Season 23. His energy has not aged. His behavior, at least his surface behavior, has not aged. He is the same person in every episode. The same laugh, the same cadence, the same relentless preoccupation with women and physical pleasure, the same swaggering confidence about his ability to attract attention, but 61 years old. Think about what that means in the world of the show. Think about the history that number contains. The show has established, through various flashback episodes and throwaway references, that Quagmire served in the military. He was in the Navy, specifically as a pilot, specifically during the Vietnam War era, and this is confirmed not just through jokes and casual references but through actual narrative content. In a flashback episode that depicts a 1973 reunion scene, Quagmire is shown returning home from Vietnam, and Peter greets him at the airfield. The episode treats this as established history, something that is simply true about Quagmire, part of the bedrock of who he is. And that is interesting, because it means that the man who sits at the bar at the Drunken Clam, making the same jokes he has been making since Season 1, is a Vietnam veteran. He has been in combat. He has been in a war zone. He has seen things and experienced things that the show has almost never engaged with directly, that lie just beneath the surface of the character like a geological layer from a different era, compressed and mostly invisible, but structurally significant. The show occasionally dips into Quagmire's past, and each time it does, it reveals something unexpected. It turns out his father, revealed in a later season episode, was a military man as well, a Navy commander, and the episode involving his father opens a door into Quagmire's family history that is considerably darker and more complex than anything the surface character suggests. His sister has appeared in episodes dealing with domestic abuse. His mother's story has been touched on. None of these threads have been tied together into a coherent picture, because the show is not interested in coherent pictures of Quagmire's inner life. It uses him as a comic character first and a human being second, and the glimpses of the human being are always offered and then withdrawn. But the Vietnam thread is the most interesting one. There is a version of Quagmire that the show has never told, one that would require taking seriously the idea that a man who went through that war and came home to ordinary suburban life in Rhode Island carries something from that experience. Something that might explain, or at least complicate, the relentless surface behavior, the way he throws himself into pleasure, the specific kind of restless, tireless pursuit of sensation that defines his public persona. There is a school of thought about people who have been through extreme experiences that says the pursuit of intensity in ordinary life is sometimes a response to having lived through something that made ordinary life feel thin and unreal. Not always, not neatly, but sometimes. The show does not go there. It does not want to go there. Quagmire is funnier as a cartoon of unchecked ID than as a person with a history that shaped him. But the information is there, embedded in the canon, raising questions that the narrative never answers. Then there is the age question in a different form. If Quagmire is 61, and the show is set in roughly the present day, then he is 10 or 15 years older than Peter and the other characters in the core friend group. The show has never really engaged with this. Quagmire's age gap relative to Peter and Joe has never produced any meaningful story content or any examination of why a man in his early 60s spends his evenings at the same bar as men in their early to mid-40s, participating in the same kind of life. He drifts through the narrative as if his age is simply a number on a form, rather than a biographical fact with implications. There is also the question of how Quagmire maintains his lifestyle. He works as an airline pilot, and the show has used this as a source of material in various episodes, but his income relative to his apparent quality of life, his house, his car, his ability to fund what appears to be an extraordinarily active social life, has never been examined. He seems to move through the world with a financial ease that the show never quite explains and never quite contradicts. And then there is his relationship with Brian. The famous speech that Quagmire delivers in a Season 8 episode, laying out in specific and brutal terms exactly why he cannot stand Brian Griffin, is one of the most talked about moments in the show's recent history. And it is interesting because the speech is devastatingly accurate. Everything Quagmire says about Brian in that moment is backed up by the show's own evidence. Brian is a hypocrite. Brian is pretentious about an intellectual life that does not match his actual output. Brian hits on Lois. Brian abandoned a child. The speech is correct. But the question that the speech raises and never answers is why Quagmire, of all people, is the one delivering it. Quagmire, whose own conduct over the years of the show would fill a legal complaint several pages long. Quagmire, who has done things that make Brian's worst behavior look like minor social awkwardness. The show frames the speech as Quagmire speaking a truth that the audience recognizes, but has been waiting for someone to say out loud. And there is pleasure in that. But there is also something deeply strange about Quagmire as the moral critic of anyone else's behavior, and the show does not really engage with that strangeness. It lets the speech land and moves on. The mystery of Glenn Quagmire is the mystery of a character who has been on screen for more than 25 years and remained, in the most fundamental sense, unknown. We know his age, we know his job. We know his history, in broad strokes. We know his preferences and his habits and his signature laugh. But we do not know why he is the way he is, not in a way that goes deeper than surface description. We do not know what he is like when the curtain comes down and he is alone in his house and there is no performance to give. We do not know what he thinks about at night, what he regrets, what he hopes for, what the Vietnam flashback and the brother he has never mentioned, and the complicated family history amount to when they are all held in a single person's life. And maybe that is appropriate. Some people are mysteries to the people who know them longest and best. The 61-year-old man who has been everybody's friend for 25 years and who nobody actually knows. Section 5. Peter Griffin's True Origins, the Bloodline Mystery. Peter Griffin was born in Mexico. This is canon. It is confirmed in the episode called Padre de Familia, and the circumstances of that birth are not exactly standard. His mother, Thelma, went to Mexico City specifically to terminate the pregnancy. The termination was unsuccessful. Peter arrived anyway, was smuggled back to Rhode Island in a way the show depicts with a particular blend of dark comedy that is entirely its own, and Thelma raised him in Providence, where he grew up believing he was the son of the cold, distant, deeply Catholic man named Francis Griffin, who raised him with the specific combination of high standards and withheld affection that produces a very particular kind of adult. Except Francis Griffin was not his father, not biologically. This revelation comes in the episode Peter's Two Dads, when Francis dies and Peter, encouraged by Brian, visits a hypnotherapist who helps him surface a buried memory of Francis, telling him directly that he was not his biological son. Thelma, confronted by Peter, admits the truth. She had an affair while on vacation in Ireland with a man named Mickey McFinnigan. Mickey is the town drunk of a small Irish village. He is loud, warm, reckless, overweight, and accompanied by a talking sheep who functions as a comic mirror of Brian Griffin. He looks almost exactly like Peter, just with a full red beard and the weathered quality of someone who has spent decades drinking outdoors. The moment Peter meets Mickey, the resemblance is immediate and overwhelming, not just physical. Something in the temperament, the laugh, the particular frequency of self-destruction that both men vibrate at constantly Mickey is what Peter would be if Peter had no family and no pretense of social integration. He is Peter with all the context stripped away, just the core disposition left running. And Peter proves he is Mickey's son the only way that Mickey accepts as proof, which is by out-drinking him. They drink until both of them are speaking pure gibberish, and then Mickey passes out first, and when he comes around, he looks at Peter with a recognition that has nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with shared biological capacity. Nobody but his blood could survive that much, he says, or something close to it. The logic is impressionistic, but the emotion is real. So here is the situation that this creates. Peter Griffin's legal father was a man who raised him with little warmth and a lot of silent expectation, who knew all along that Peter was not his biological son and chose to stay in the family, but apparently let that secret calcify into something like low-level resentment that expressed itself as coldness. His biological father is a cheerful, reckless, self-destructive Irishman who has been living on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, entirely unaware that he has a son. His mother, Thelma, carried the secret for more than 40 years, and eventually told the truth only because circumstances forced her to. This is a significant piece of backstory, not just for Peter's character, but for the whole question of what the Griffin family actually is and where it actually came from. Francis Griffin raised children who are not his biological grandchildren. The traits that the show treats as the essential Peter, the impulsiveness, the appetite, the cheerful self-destructiveness, the inability to learn from experience, the bottomless physical needs, those traits did not come from the man whose name he carries. They came from a drunk in a village on the west coast of Ireland who Peter did not meet until he was in his 40s. And then there is the further complication, which is Peter's own complicated relationship with parenthood. He has been revealed, over the course of the show's run, to be the biological father of an extraordinary number of children that nobody knew about. In one episode, it emerges that past sperm donations he made resulted in something in the neighborhood of 82 additional children. In another storyline, a sperm bank mix-up produces Bertram, Stewie's nemesis and half-brother, who also shares Peter's DNA. The Griffin bloodline turns out to be wider and stranger and more dispersed than any normal family map would suggest. But the Meg wrinkle is the one that complicates things most dramatically, because it turns out, in a quiet moment from a Season 3 episode, that Peter may not even be Meg's biological father. Brian, in the episode called Screwed the Pooch, demonstrates his knowledge of the Griffin children by revealing a detail that Peter does not know, which is that Meg's real father is a man named Stan Thompson. This is delivered as a throwaway line, a joke, a quick piece of improbably specific information that Brian deploys to make a point. And then the episode moves on, and Stan Thompson is never mentioned again. Not in that episode, not in any subsequent episode, not ever. Stan Thompson, the man who may be the biological father of the character the show most frequently and aggressively dismisses. We know his name and nothing else. We do not know when he and Lois were together. We do not know what happened to the relationship. We do not know whether Lois told Peter, whether Peter knows, whether this is something that simply sits in the background of the show's continuity as a fact that has never been picked back up. The show has since added competing versions of Meg's origin story, various flashbacks and cutaways that suggest different things about how she came to be, and none of them are entirely consistent with each other or with the Stan Thompson revelation. What we are left with is a Griffin family tree that looks, on closer inspection, like a diagram of uncertainty. Peter's lineage is Irish but was hidden beneath an Irish Catholic adoptive father. Meg may have a biological father who has never appeared in the show. The children who carry the Griffin name may or may not all share the Griffin DNA. And all of this circles back to the central question of what a family is, which the show has been circling around since its earliest episodes without ever landing on a definitive answer. Peter Griffin knows, now, that he is Mickey McFinnigan's son. He knows that the father who raised him was not his father in the biological sense. He carries both of these facts. Brian has told him they both matter, and the show moves on. But the mystery of what the Griffin family actually is, at the level of DNA and origin and hidden history, remains open. The threads are there. Nobody has picked them all up yet. Section 6. Meg Griffin's Hidden Identity. The question of who she really is. Megan Griffin has one of the most unusual narrative positions of any character in the history of American animation. She is a main character in the core family unit of a major network show. She has been voiced by a famous, accomplished actress for the vast majority of the show's run. She appears in nearly every episode. She is consistently referred to as the oldest child of Peter and Lois Griffin. And she may not actually be Peter's biological daughter, her true father having been briefly named and then permanently abandoned, her origin story having been retconned so many times that the show has produced mutually exclusive versions of how she came to exist, each one played for dark comedy, and none of them particularly concerned with the factual question of what actually happened. The name that was dropped in Season 3 was Stan Thompson. That is all we have. A name, no face, no context, no story. Brian delivers the information casually, as evidence of his detailed knowledge of the Griffin family, and the show treats it as a punchline and moves on. But the punchline has a weight to it that did not go away. If Meg's biological father is a man named Stan Thompson, then Lois had a relationship with someone other than Peter at some point before or during her marriage, and that relationship produced a child, and that child was brought into the Griffin household and has been there ever since, wearing the family name, being treated as the least valued member of a family she may only be half connected to. The implications of this are vast, and the show has never explored them. There have been subsequent episodes that complicate the picture further. In an episode from a later season, a flashback suggests that Peter and Lois once tried to abandon infant Meg at a fire station, a scene that is presented as dark humor. In another moment, there is a suggestion that Peter has always known, on some level, that Meg is not his biological daughter, and that this knowledge is part of the architecture of his cruelty toward her. If Peter knows she is not his, or suspects it, the way he treats her takes on a different quality. Not just the cartoonish cruelty of a bad father figure, but something more specific and more corrosive. There is also a fan theory, one that has gained significant traction in the years since it was first articulated, which takes the Meg mystery in a completely different direction. This theory proposes that Meg is not Stewie's sister at all, but his biological mother. The argument runs roughly like this. Meg, before the show begins, was in a relationship that ended badly. She became pregnant. Lois and Brian, working together, helped cover up the pregnancy by staging a fake pregnancy for Lois, allowing the family to present Stewie as Lois's child, when in fact he was Meg's. The theory draws support from a few specific episodes, most notably Yug Yillamaf, in which Brian's time machine malfunction causes events to run backwards and Stewie's birth is shown from his perspective, with some ambiguity about whose face he sees when he enters the world. The theory has significant holes. The timeline is awkward. Peter and Chris's intelligence levels make it difficult to believe either of them would not notice a phantom pregnancy. The show has actually confirmed Stewie's parentage fairly definitively through the Bertram storyline, in which Stewie's half-brother exists because of Peter's sperm donation, which would require Peter to actually be Stewie's biological father. So the Meg's mother theory does not survive contact with established canon particularly well, but it remains interesting as a piece of fan thinking, because it says something true about Meg as a character regardless of whether the specific claim is accurate. It says that Meg's identity within the family is unstable, that her belonging is questioned, that something about her position in the household has never quite added up, and that fans have been so attentive to that instability that they constructed an entire alternative history to explain it. The most honest version of the Meg mystery is probably this. The show introduced Stan Thompson and then forgot about him, or chose not to pursue the thread, or made the decision that the comedy of Meg's situation was more valuable than the accuracy of her origin story. The retcons piled up over years of episodic television where continuity is always secondary to the immediate comedic need of a given script. Meg became many different things at many different times because the writers were not maintaining a coherent record of what she was supposed to be. But the absence of resolution does not make the question less interesting. It makes it more interesting. Stan Thompson is out there somewhere, in the implied geography of the show's universe, a man who has a daughter he may or may not know about, a daughter who has spent her entire life at the bottom of a family hierarchy that may be built, in part, on a fiction. He has never appeared. He has never been mentioned again. He exists as a name in a single line of dialogue from a Season 3 episode, and that is all he will ever be. Unless the show, in some future episode, decides to pick that thread back up, to let Stan Thompson walk through the door and change everything about what we understand Meg's story to be, it is unlikely. The show does not tend to revisit mysteries once it has lost interest in them. But it is not impossible. And the possibility, however thin, is part of what makes the mystery worth sitting with. Meg Griffin, oldest child of Peter and Lois, daughter of Stan Thompson. Maybe. Possibly Stewie's mother, according to a theory that does not quite hold together but says something true anyway. Certainly the most wronged character in the show, regardless of her precise biological origins. The question of who she actually is, at the level of blood and history, has never been answered. And the show has 20-some seasons of episodes ahead of it, each one a potential context in which the answer might finally arrive. Or it might not. That is the nature of a mystery that runs this long. Section 7. Death himself, the mythology of the Grim Reaper. There is a version of every long-running story universe where the architecture of the metaphysical is just as detailed and elaborate as the architecture of the physical. The rules that govern what happens when someone dies, who collects them, where they go, what the experience of mortality actually looks like from the inside. Most television shows, even long-running ones, avoid engaging with this territory too directly. The questions are too large, the answers too contested, and the comedy of a sitcom universe typically requires the ability to brush past death without weighing it down with genuine philosophical gravity. Family Guy has not avoided this territory. Family Guy has walked directly into it, built a specific and strange mythology around death and the afterlife, and the bureaucratic machinery of mortality, and then left enormous chunks of that mythology unexplained. The result is one of the more quietly fascinating pieces of world-building in the show's history, a cosmology of death that is both funnier and stranger than it has any right to be. Death himself, the Grim Reaper, is a recurring character. He first appears in a Season 2 episode called Death is a Bitch, in circumstances that are characteristic of the show's entire approach to supernatural figures. He arrives with great solemnity and then immediately becomes a comedic inconvenience. Specifically, Peter has faked his own death on an insurance form, technically triggering the machinery that is supposed to deliver death to the Griffin doorstep. Death arrives, and then he twists his ankle chasing Peter and is forced to spend time convalescing in the Griffin house, during which the normal operations of human mortality are suspended because Death cannot do his job with a sprained ankle, and Peter has to go around doing Death's work for him, wearing the cloak and carrying the scythe and finding the whole thing significantly more uncomfortable than he expected. This premise alone tells you something important about the mythology the show is building. Death is not an abstract force. He is a person. He has a body that can be injured. He has physical limitations. He sprains his ankle. He has a mother he lives with. He has personal insecurities, specifically around women, specifically because of a habit during his adolescence of accidentally killing girls he liked. He has a collection of embarrassing films he has appeared in that he would rather not discuss. He has asthma. He is, in almost every way that matters, a fully realized character with a biography and a psychology, placed into a role that should, by definition, be beyond individual biography and psychology. And this raises a genuine question about the nature of the death in the Family Guy universe. If the Grim Reaper is a person, was he always a person? Did he choose this role? Was he assigned it? Is there a selection process? The show touches on this question in a few different places but never gives a complete answer. At one point, it is suggested that when Death himself dies, a human is recruited to take his place. The mechanics of this transition are implied rather than explained. What we know is that the position exists, that it is filled by a specific individual at any given time, and that individual has the full complement of human experiences, human limitations, and human problems, while also being responsible for the entirety of human mortality. The voice of Death changed over the show's run. In the first appearance, he was voiced by Norm Macdonald, in a performance that had a particular deadpan quality that suited the character's flat affect and his apparent surprise at finding himself in a situation this embarrassing. In subsequent appearances, the role was taken over by Adam Carolla, who gave the character more warmth and more obvious social awkwardness. A death who is not coldly inevitable, but rather somebody who would really rather not have to collect you today if you do not mind. The mythology around what happens after death comes to you is also fascinating and incomplete. The show has depicted multiple afterlives, or at least multiple possible destinations for the departed. Heaven has appeared in several episodes, and its depiction is inconsistent, sometimes literally cloud and harps, sometimes a more ambiguous happy place, sometimes a bureaucracy with its own paperwork. Hell has also appeared and has its own rules, its own geography, its own relationship to the other afterlife options. The show has never committed to a single unified picture of what happens after you die, which is either a creative limitation or a deliberate hedge. And the gap between those two readings is another mystery in itself. What is most interesting about Death as a character, though, is not the cosmological questions he raises, but the question of his specific personal history. He lives with his mother. That detail alone deserves to sit with you for a moment. The entity responsible for every human death that has ever occurred, past, present, and future, comes home at the end of each day to a house where his mother is waiting for him. He grew up, presumably as a child who then became Death, and before he became Death, he was whatever he was. There was a life before this role. There was a person before there was a death. And we know almost nothing about either of those things. The show has given us enough to be curious and not enough to be satisfied, which is probably exactly where it intended to leave us. There is also the theological layer of the show's universe, which is stranger than the death mythology alone. God himself has appeared in Family Guy, and Jesus has appeared, and various other divine and semi-divine figures, and none of their appearances are fully consistent with each other or with the death mythology, and taken together they suggest a universe with a very specific and very peculiar relationship to the metaphysical. It is a universe where the divine is real but also very small, very human, very subject to the same absurdities and embarrassments that everyone else in the show navigates. God has personal preferences and personal quirks. Jesus has social anxieties. Death has asthma and a mother. It is a universe where the machinery of the eternal is staffed by people who are, fundamentally, no different from the people on the street below them, which is either comforting or unsettling depending on your angle of approach. Section 8. Stewie's Time Machine and the Paradox Problem. In the canon of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin built his first time machine to avoid teething. That is where the story begins. That is the first recorded deployment of what will become one of the most cosmologically significant pieces of technology in the show's universe. A device whose implications have never been fully traced, whose paradoxes have never been resolved, and whose existence in the hands of a one-year-old baby is, when you sit with it long enough, among the most quietly terrifying things the show has ever depicted. The time machine, across multiple seasons and multiple versions, has been used for everything from personal convenience to preventing the complete unmaking of reality. The adventures that Stewie and Brian take in it are a whole genre within the show, usually referred to in fan discussion as the Road to episodes. A series of standalone adventure stories that take the two characters out of the normal domestic setting and into something stranger and bigger. These episodes are generally among the most beloved the show has produced, and they all exist because of the time machine, because of Stewie's decision to build something that allows movement through the fourth dimension in order to avoid an uncomfortable developmental milestone. But the time machine is not just a vehicle for adventure stories. It is a narrative problem that the show has been gently sitting next to for years without fully engaging with it. The problem is paradox. The problem is the question of what it means to have a device that can change the past in a universe where the past has already produced the present, and whether changes to the past retroactively change the present, and if so, what that means for the characters who remember both versions, and whether memory is reliable in a universe where the timeline is malleable, and who or what is keeping track. The show has offered a few different and incompatible answers to these questions at different points in its run. In some episodes, changes to the past produce immediate ripple effects in the present, creating alternate timelines that the characters then have to navigate back from. In other episodes, changes to the past seem to have no effect on anything until someone specifically notices and responds to the anomaly. In still other episodes, the past and the future seem to exist in a kind of fluid relationship, where the rules are whatever they need to be in order to make the plot work. The most significant time travel storyline in the show's entire history is the one surrounding Brian's death. In Season 12, Brian is struck by a car and dies. Stewie, having destroyed his time machine immediately before the accident, out of concern about the ethical implications of time travel, is unable to go back and prevent it. The family mourns. A new dog named Vinny comes to live with them. And then, in a Christmas episode just a few weeks later, Stewie encounters his past self, from a time before the machine was destroyed, and borrows the return pad that past Stewie carries, using it to travel back and push Brian out of the path of the car. This is a moving sequence, and the episode does a good job of making it feel emotionally significant. But it also raises a cascade of questions that the show never pauses to address. If Stewie was able to go back and save Brian, then the entire intermediate timeline, the one where Brian died and Vinny came to live with the family and the Griffins grieved, is erased. But Stewie remembers it. He was there for both versions, which means the universe is now running on a timeline where Brian never died, while the person who saved him remembers a version of events that no longer exists for anyone else. What happens to Vinny in the erased timeline? He exists in a version of events that has been deleted. He came into the Griffins' lives specifically because Brian died. Brian did not die. Therefore, the conditions of Vinny's existence have been retroactively removed. He is a character whose presence depended on a tragedy that, in the current version of the timeline, never happened. The show does not address this. It is, in the most literal sense, as if he was never there. And Stewie himself carries around the memory of a dead friend who, in the current version of the timeline, has been alive the whole time. This means that at every moment after the reset, Stewie is living with a knowledge that nobody else in his life shares. He knows that Brian died. He knows what it felt like. He knows the specific grief of losing his best friend and living with the loss long enough to understand that it was real. And then he prevented it, and Brian came back, and everything went back to normal, except for the part that happened inside Stewie's mind. That never went back to normal. That version of events is still there, archived in his memory, a history that no longer has a present. Then there is the larger cosmological revelation that came in the episode called The Big Bang Theory. This episode establishes something genuinely extraordinary about Stewie and his device. After a fight in the time machine takes Stewie and Brian outside the space-time continuum entirely, they find themselves in a void that precedes all of reality. To escape, they are forced to overload the return pad and create an explosion powerful enough to blast them back into the universe. And then, examining the energy signature of that explosion afterward, Stewie realizes that it matches the background radiation left by the Big Bang itself. He created the universe. The explosion that returned him and Brian to the space-time continuum was the event that created the space-time continuum in the first place. Which means the universe created Stewie so Stewie could create the universe so the universe could create Stewie, in a temporal causality loop that has no beginning and no end, and cannot be understood as a linear sequence of cause and effect at all. It is a closed loop, a self-creating system. Everything that has ever existed, including the capacity for time machines to be built and for Brian and Stewie to fight over control of one, is downstream of an explosion that those same two beings caused. The show presents this as a clever joke and moves on. But if you take it seriously, and there is no reason not to, it changes everything about the nature of the show's universe. It means that all of it, every episode, every character, every moment of comedy and tragedy and cutaway gag, exists because of Stewie Griffin and his invention. Not metaphorically, literally. The universe in which Family Guy takes place is Stewie's universe in the most fundamental sense possible. He made it, accidentally, while fighting with his dog over a steering mechanism in a machine that he originally built to avoid teething. And he is 1 year old. The paradox problem does not end there. In Road to Germany, Brian, Stewie, and Mort Goldman travel back to September 1939 to obtain uranium for the time machine's fuel supply. This storyline involves them moving through Nazi Germany, posing as Hitler at one point, and ultimately escaping. And, to prevent the time travel events from repeating, Stewie kills the version of Mort who traveled through time with them, as the show treats this as a responsible and necessary precaution rather than a fundamental moral crisis. But consider what that means. There is now a version of Mort Goldman who never came home from 1939. There is a body or a hole in the timeline where a person used to be. The show treats this as a logistical problem that was neatly resolved. The implications of what actually happened are left for the audience to sit with alone. The time machine is the most powerful device in the show's universe, and it is kept in a baby's bedroom. The baby has, on at least one documented occasion, used it to destroy and then recreate his own closest friendship. He has, on another occasion, created the universe with it. He has, on multiple occasions, traveled through time in ways that should, by any coherent theory of temporal mechanics, have left the timeline looking like a bowl of wet string. And the show continues, episode after episode, with the device sitting in Stewie's room, waiting for the next adventure, the next mistake, the next impossibility that will be treated as reasonable and forgotten by the following week. The paradox problem is not a problem the show is trying to solve. It is a problem the show is living inside, contentedly, as if paradox were just another piece of furniture in the Griffin house, a little unusual, perfectly comfortable, nothing to worry about. Section 9. The Multiverse of Family Guy Alternate Realities and What They Reveal. The existence of a working time machine in Stewie's bedroom opens a door that the show has walked through on several memorable occasions, and behind that door is a territory that the show's world-building has explored with characteristic enthusiasm and characteristic incompleteness. The territory of alternate reality. The possibility, native to the mechanics of time travel, that the timeline Stewie and Brian navigate through is not the only timeline. That other versions of Quahog exist, other versions of the Griffin family, other histories that branched off from this one at some junction where a decision went differently. The most extensive exploration of this territory comes in the Season 8 premiere episode, Road to the Multiverse, in which Stewie builds a remote control that allows travel between parallel universes, and he and Brian bounce through a series of alternate quahogs that function as a sequence of extended gags. There is a universe where everything is drawn in a hyper-realistic style, one where Quahog is an idyllic version of the 1950s, one where the world is governed by robots, one where humans are the pets of dogs rather than the other way around. Each universe is a single joke extended to the length of a scene and then abandoned for the next one. But the episode also establishes something significant beyond the comedy. It establishes that the multiverse exists, that there are, within the logic of the show's cosmology, an indefinite number of parallel quahogs running simultaneously, each one the product of a slightly different version of the history that led to the current timeline. And the existence of those parallel universes creates questions about the one we follow that the show has never addressed. What are the conditions that produce the specific universe we see? What specific decisions and events, in the long chain of cause and effect that produced the present, resulted in this particular family, this particular constellation of neighbors and friends, this particular version of Stewie, and Brian and Peter and Lois? The multiverse premise implies that there are versions of the story where none of these people are who we know them to be, where Peter and Lois never met, where Stewie was born different, or not born at all, where Brian remained on the street and was never adopted, where the entire edifice of the show's universe rests on choices and coincidences that, in any of the other running timelines, went another way. The dog-ruled universe is probably the most philosophically interesting of the alternate realities depicted in the episode, not because of its own internal logic, but because of what it says about Brian. In the dog-ruled universe, Brian and his dog counterpart of Stewie are at the top of the social hierarchy. Humans are kept as pets. The relationship between species has been entirely inverted, and Brian for a moment seems genuinely comfortable in that universe. He enjoys the status. He appreciates what it feels like to be seen as more than a pet, to have his capacity and his intelligence recognized by the structure of the world around him, rather than treated as a charming aberration. It is a small thing, but it is also a window into something the show does not usually let itself say directly. Brian's life in the Prime universe, for all that he is integrated into the Griffin family and loved in the specific and limited ways that the family manages to love anyone, is a life where his fundamental nature is routinely underestimated and routinely dismissed. He is, in the eyes of most of the world around him, still a dog, still a pet, still something that a human owns, rather than something that exists for its own purposes and on its own terms. The alternate universe where dogs rule is the universe where Brian does not have to negotiate with that. There is also the question of what multiple universes mean for identity and continuity in a more personal sense. If there is a universe where Stewie was born without his particular intelligence, or with his intelligence but without his friendship with Brian, then is the Stewie we know defined by his specific history or by some essential quality that would persist across versions? Are the characters we follow the same people they are in their parallel versions, with a different biography layered on top? Or is the history constitutive? Is Peter the lovable mess he is because of a specific sequence of experiences? Or would any version of Peter, in any universe, end up making the same kinds of mistakes in slightly different contexts? The show has also used alternate history, specifically the past alteration version of the alternate timeline, in ways that reveal things about its characters without the narrative needing to comment on them directly. The episode where Peter accidentally punches young Ernie the chicken at a school dance in the 1980s is quietly revealing because it implies that the feud between Peter and Ernie was not simply the product of an expired coupon in the present day. It was waiting to happen. The animosity has a prehistory that neither of them remembers, a moment of accidental violence in a high school gymnasium that laid the emotional groundwork for every subsequent confrontation. Time travel revealed something about the feud that was already true before the feud officially began. The multiverse of Family Guy is a place the show visits occasionally for comedy and then retreats from before it has to engage with what it actually implies. But the implications are there, sitting patiently in the background of every episode, reminding anyone who looks that this story is only one of countless possible stories, that the Griffin family we follow is only one of countless possible Griffins, and that somewhere in the infinite branching of the timeline, there is a version of this universe where everything turned out differently, where Brian finished his novel, where Meg was treated with the kindness she deserved from the beginning, where Stewie never lost the edge that made him extraordinary. Those universes exist in the logic of the show's own cosmology. We just do not have a remote control that reaches them. Section 10. The Geography of Impossibility. Quahog's Strange Physics. Quahog, Rhode Island is a fictional town placed within a real state, and that placement is part of what gives the show its particular texture. Rhode Island is a real place. Providence is a real city. The geography of New England is real. The cultural attitudes of the region, the particular blend of Catholicism and sports fanaticism and blue-collar working-class identity and proximity to elite institutions are all real things that the show draws on constantly. Peter is emphatically a product of a specific regional culture, and the show's creators know that culture from the inside. But Quahog itself is impossible. Not in the fantasy sense, where impossibility is understood and accepted and incorporated into the story's logic. In the more mundane and stranger sense, where the impossibility accumulates gradually across hundreds of episodes and is never addressed because the show never looks directly at its own geography long enough to notice the problem. The problem is scale. Quahog, as depicted in the show, is simultaneously a small, close-knit town where everyone knows everyone, and a vast, sprawling urban environment with airports, universities, major public institutions, professional sports teams, government buildings, international connections, and a population that seems to vary between intimate neighborhood and mid-sized city depending on what the episode requires. The Drunken Clam is a neighborhood bar where Peter and his friends are known and comfortable and part of the furniture. 2 blocks away, apparently, is an institution large enough to host a significant community event. 3 miles in another direction is an international airport. The size of Quahog changes between episodes in ways that have nothing to do with any internal logic. In episodes that require a small, tight community where everyone's business is everyone else's business, Quahog is that. In episodes that require the isolation and anonymity of an urban environment where characters can do extraordinary things without social consequence, Quahog is that. The show holds both versions simultaneously without ever acknowledging the contradiction. The streets change, landmarks appear and disappear. The distance between the Griffin House and the Swanson House and the Quagmire House, 3 properties that are ostensibly right next to each other in a residential neighborhood, varies so dramatically between episodes that, in some cases, the walk between them would take minutes, and in other cases, it would take what the physics of the visual space implies. Would be a significant journey. The house itself has rooms that appear and disappear, layouts that shift between visits, a basement that is sometimes referenced and sometimes does not exist, an attic that functions as a plot device in select episodes. The Drunken Clam, the bar that serves as the social center of the male characters' lives, is one of the most geographically flexible buildings in the show's universe. Its interior has been larger and smaller at different points in its history. Its exterior has changed. Its neighborhood context has shifted. It has been implied to be walking distance from the Griffin House in some episodes and a drive away in others. The show treats it as a fixed point in the character's social geography while never committing to a fixed point in the show's physical geography. None of this is unusual for an animated comedy. The Simpsons Springfield has the same property of being simultaneously small enough for everyone to know everyone and large enough to contain an extraordinary range of institutions and locations and demographics. The inconsistency is built into the genre. Animation allows for a kind of spatial flexibility that live action cannot achieve, because the sets are rebuilt every episode from scratch, drawn to whatever dimensions the story needs. But in Family Guy's case, the geographic impossibility connects to a deeper mystery about the show's relationship to its own world. The writers have, over the years, created a substantial internal mythology for Quahog. Its founding history has been depicted. Its local politics have been explored in multiple episodes. Its most famous recurring locations have been visited so many times that they feel like they should have a fixed relationship to each other in some coherent map. And yet that map has never been coherently drawn, and the show's treatment of space remains entirely fluid, shifting to serve the story and never anchoring itself in any physical reality. The question of what Quahog actually is, as a place, as a location in the physical world of the show, is one that the narrative itself seems to have no interest in answering. It is a set, in the loosest possible sense, a collection of locations that can be reassembled in whatever order the story requires. The geography is not a mystery with a solution waiting to be found. It is a mystery that exists precisely because the show never needed it to have a solution. You can live in a place without mapping it. And the Griffin family has been living in Quahog for more than 25 years without ever fully knowing where they are. Section 11. Ernie the Giant Chicken. The feud that cannot end. There is a man-sized chicken who hates Peter Griffin with the sustained renewable fury of someone who has been genuinely wronged in a way they will never be able to fully articulate. His name is Ernie. He is an anthropomorphic chicken, bipedal, articulate enough to have had dinner conversation and a marriage and an apparent social life. He first appeared in a Season 2 episode called Da Boom, and when he and Peter make eye contact, the universe seems to narrow to just the two of them, and whatever was happening before that moment simply stops. The fights between Peter and Ernie are some of the most technically elaborate and physically impossible set pieces the show has ever produced. They are long, they are expensive in animation terms, they are meticulously choreographed acts of mutual destruction that take the two combatants through the geography of Quahog and beyond it, through sewers and buildings and airplanes and, on at least one occasion, through time itself. They demolish their environment with the casual completeness of forces of nature. Buildings come down, vehicles are destroyed, bystanders are injured, probably killed, certainly traumatized. And then the fight ends, usually with Peter appearing to have won, limping back to whatever he was doing before the encounter, battered and exhausted and apparently having forgotten what he was originally doing. And Ernie, who appeared to be dead, opens one eye. And the cycle is ready to begin again. The origin of the feud is officially resolved in the Da Boom episode, where a flashback establishes that Ernie once gave Peter a coupon that turned out to be expired. Peter's reaction to this expired coupon was to attack Ernie, which triggered Ernie's retaliatory rage, which has sustained itself across dozens of years of fictional time and more battles than either of them can count. That is the official explanation. An expired coupon? And of course this is absurd. Of course it is. The absurdity is the point. A feud of this scale and this violence and this endurance, between two beings who have clearly committed the full weight of themselves to its perpetuation, cannot really be about an expired coupon. The coupon was a spark, maybe, but what was already there? Waiting to ignite? What is it about Peter Griffin and this particular giant chicken that produces something this enormous from something this trivial? The show has actually, in at least one episode, tried to let them resolve it. There was a dinner, an apparent peace, a moment where Ernie introduced his wife, Nicole, and Peter sat across from both of them at a table, and they spoke like people rather than combatants. And the peace lasted until the check arrived, and both of them reached for it simultaneously. The desire to pay the bill, the specific and deeply gendered refusal to let the other one absorb the social obligation of paying, was enough. A new fight. A new round of mutual destruction. The peace that seemed possible shattered on the particular kind of pride that makes generosity feel like weakness. This is interesting, because it suggests that the feud is not really about the coupon, and was never really about the coupon. It is about something in the dynamic between them that cannot be resolved by good manners or a dinner in a restaurant. There is something about Peter and Ernie together that produces conflict the way certain chemicals produce heat when combined. Not because either of them is evil, not because the original grievance was serious, but because something about the way they read each other, the way they respond to each other's presence, is permanently set to a frequency that only violence can discharge. The time travel episode that threw them into a fight across multiple historical eras and eventually into a genetic research lab and outer space pushed this to its logical extreme. They cannot stop, even in contexts that make the fight completely abstract and untethered from any origin in the present. The fight becomes its own reason. The feud is self-perpetuating, metabolizing whatever fuel is nearby and continuing regardless of context. Ernie has a wife. He has a child. There is a kid in Stewie's preschool who is apparently Ernie's. He has a domestic life. A life that presumably involves evenings at home and meals prepared and mornings that begin without violence. He is not simply a being of pure, destructive fury. He is a person, an anthropomorphic chicken who is a person, who has a context outside the feud and who presumably experiences himself as something other than Peter Griffin's eternal enemy. But we never see that side of him for more than a moment, and the moment is always interrupted by the resumption of hostilities. The most interesting unanswered question about Ernie is whether he has any awareness of the absurdity of his own situation. Whether, in the quiet of whatever his life looks like when Peter is not in it, he ever steps back from the accumulated enormity of the feud and tries to locate what he is actually defending. The coupon was expired. That was real. The slight was real, in the small, trivial way that slights are real. And then Peter attacked him, which was also real, and which created a completely legitimate grievance on Ernie's part. But the scale of the response, the sustained, decades-long, universe-crossing campaign of violence. Does Ernie know that it has gone past any proportion to the original event? Does he know and not care? Does he know and care but cannot find a way to stop? The show will never answer this. Ernie is a gag, an extremely well-developed gag with an internal mythology and a remarkable degree of attention to its own internal logic, but a gag. He exists to produce the fight scenes. The psychology behind the fight scenes is implied but never examined, and the mystery of what it means to be the chicken in this situation, the one who keeps returning to a fight that no sane calculation of cost and benefit could justify, is a mystery that the show has built very carefully around without ever looking at directly. Section 12. The final mystery, is any of it real? And now we arrive at the deepest question, the one that underlies all the others, the one that, if you follow it far enough, does not resolve any of the individual mysteries we have been discussing, but reframes all of them in a way that is either deeply satisfying or deeply unsettling, or, most likely, both at the same time. Is any of it real? This is not a question about animation, about the obvious fact that what we are watching is drawn rather than lived. It is a question that the show has, in various ways and at various levels of seriousness, raised about its own narrative. A question about whether the events of the show, within its own fictional universe, are meant to be taken as the show's objective reality, or whether the entire thing is being filtered through a perspective that distorts, selects, and transforms what is actually happening. The theory that has the most internal evidence behind it, the one that has been developed most carefully by fans who have spent serious time with it, proposes that the events of Family Guy are happening inside the mind of a single character. There are two main candidates for whose mind this might be. One is Stewie, one is Peter. The Stewie version of the theory runs as follows. The show is Stewie's experience of the world, as interpreted through the cognitive and emotional framework of a one-year-old baby. Peter appears as a buffoon because, from a baby's perspective, a father who is trying to entertain and engage with a small child, making silly noises and doing exaggerated things to get a response, looks exactly like a buffoon. He is performing buffoonery because that is what you do with babies, but the baby is recording it as his essential nature. Lois appears as an adversary, the strict disciplinarian who controls access to food and comfort and freedom, because that is how a one-year-old experiences a caretaker who has limits and enforces them. Meg appears abused because a teenager who is frequently dismissed and occasionally frustrated and navigating the particular difficulties of adolescence looks, through a small child's eyes, like someone being hurt. Brian does not actually talk. Brian's barks and whimpers and movements are being translated, in Stewie's mind, into the full articulate voice we hear, because Stewie feels understood by Brian, feels a genuine warmth and recognition between them, and the mind renders that feeling as real speech. On this reading, all the impossible things about Stewie himself, The British accent, the weaponry, the plans for world domination, the emotional sophistication that no one-year-old should have, are the baby's internal experience of his own thoughts and impulses. Children at that age do not have language for what they feel, but they have feelings, powerful and complex feelings, and those feelings have a shape that an adult mind, describing them from inside, might render as exactly this. The Peter version of the theory is darker in a different way. It proposes that Peter is in some kind of crisis, real or imagined, and that the show is his fantasy, a constructed reality in which he is the center of a family that loves him, and a world that notices him, and a story that keeps happening. The cutaway gags on this reading are the intrusive thoughts of a man whose mind cannot stay focused on the present, who keeps drifting into association and memory and imagination in ways that disrupt the narrative of his own life. The violence that Peter sustains and dishes out, damage that should be permanent but is always resolved by the next scene, is the logic of a fantasy in which consequences do not quite stick, in which the story keeps resetting because the mind that is running it needs it to. Both versions of the theory share a key structural feature, which is that they explain the show's relationship to its own continuity. The continuity of Family Guy is notoriously fluid. Characters die and come back. Events are contradicted by subsequent events. The rules of the universe shift between episodes. The characters do not remember things that should have changed them permanently. And the usual explanation for this, the one the show itself occasionally acknowledges through its fourth wall breaks, is that it is simply how a long-running animated comedy works, that continuity is a casualty of the comedic priorities of episodic television. But the theory offers a different explanation. The continuity is fluid because it is a dream, or a fantasy, or a constructed narrative inside a mind that is not operating by the laws of objective reality. In a dream, you can die and it does not count. In a dream, the layout of a house changes between one night and the next without contradiction. In a dream, the same fight happens over and over, and the combatants are always reset to their starting positions because the dream needs them there for the next version of the conflict. The logic of the dream and the logic of the show's continuity are, in certain ways, the same logic. There is no version of this theory that the show will ever confirm. The writers are not building toward a reveal, are not planning a finale in which the frame narrative is lifted and the true nature of the Griffin family's reality is disclosed. That is not what Family Guy is doing. The show is not a puzzle with a solution. It is a long, strange, funny, often uncomfortable, occasionally brilliant journey through a universe that the creators built from the inside without always knowing what its edges looked like. But the theory does something useful even if it is not true. It forces you to look at the show differently, to notice the ways that its internal logic resembles the logic of a mind processing something rather than the logic of a camera recording something. To notice that the characters who seem most real, Meg in her vulnerability, Brian in his longing, Stewie in his extraordinary inner life, are the ones who generate the most genuine feeling rather than the most reliable fact. To notice that the mysteries of the show cluster around questions of perception and consciousness and the unreliability of the narrator's own experience. Who can hear Stewie? The question is really, who is paying attention? What is Brian? The question is really, what does it mean to be more than what your body says you are? Who is Meg's father? The question is really, who does someone belong to, and why? The question underneath all the mysteries is always the question of what it means to be inside a life, any life, and to try to understand it from the inside. The Griffin family does not know the answers to most of the questions about themselves. They live with the mysteries the way all of us live with the mysteries of our own existence, by moving through them without resolving them. By making dinner and watching television and going to the bar and coming home and waking up the next morning and doing it again. The questions are not solved. The questions are simply what life looks like from the inside. And maybe that is the most honest thing the show has ever said about anything. Not a punchline, not a cutaway. Just the gentle, persistent acknowledgement that there are things about even the most familiar story that you will never quite understand, no matter how long you watch it, no matter how many times you go back to the beginning and look again. The baby in the crib is planning something. The dog is at the kitchen counter, nursing his martini, staring at the middle distance. The family is assembled in the living room, doing the things they always do. The night outside is quiet, and somewhere in Quahog's impossible geography, Ernie the giant chicken has one eye open. And the questions remain. Beautiful, unanswered, and exactly right. Section 13. Quagmire's Father and the Gender Mystery That Changed Everything. There is an episode of Family Guy that, when it aired, produced a response from the audience that was significantly more complicated than the response most episodes receive. It did something genuinely surprising, not in the shock value sense that the show increasingly relied on in its later seasons, but in the structural sense, the sense of taking an established character and revealing something about them that recontextualizes everything you thought you knew. The episode is called Quagmire's Dad. It aired in Season 8, and what it does with Glenn Quagmire's family history is one of the most discussed pieces of character work the show has produced, for reasons that are not entirely clean or comfortable. The episode reveals that Quagmire's father, Dan Quagmire, is a transgender woman named Ida. She transitions in the course of the episode. This is presented as a genuine surprise to Quagmire himself, who struggles with it, and the episode's handling of Ida's transition has been widely criticized for the way it involves Brian, who sleeps with Ida while unaware of her trans identity, and then has a very exaggerated physical reaction when he finds out. The comedy in that moment has aged badly, and was considered problematic even at the time of airing by many viewers. But, setting aside the handling of that specific joke, which deserves its criticism, the revelation about Quagmire's father creates a genuinely interesting piece of family mythology that the show has never fully explored. Quagmire grew up in a household with a parent who was living inauthentically, who was suppressing a significant part of their identity for the duration of Quagmire's childhood. The personality Quagmire grew up with, the person he understood his father to be, was a performance over a very different reality. This has implications for how Quagmire understands identity, authenticity, and the gap between public persona and private self that the show has completely ignored. Quagmire's relationship with his own identity is already a rich area that the show barely scratches. The 61-year-old who has been frozen in a single behavioral pattern for decades, the Vietnam veteran who never discusses it, the man whose surface personality is so total and so consistent that it raises genuine questions about whether there is anything beneath it. The revelation about his father adds another layer to this picture, and the show does not use it. It becomes an episode of television that aired and then receded into the canon, referenced occasionally but never developed. This is a characteristic failure mode of the show, and it applies across dozens of characters and storylines. The mythology is richer than the narrative engagement with it. The show keeps adding information without using the information it has already established. Quagmire's father is trans. Quagmire served in Vietnam. Quagmire is 61 years old. Quagmire grew up with a parent whose authentic identity was suppressed for his entire childhood. Any one of these facts, handled with real care and genuine curiosity, could anchor a season of television. All of them together constitute a character whose backstory is extraordinary and whose surface behavior has never been examined in light of that backstory. What is Quagmire protecting with all that relentless surface charm? What is he keeping at a distance with the constant performance of appetite and confidence? The show has given us the raw materials for a character study of real depth and has never conducted it. The mystery of who Glenn Quagmire actually is, beneath the performance, is a mystery that the show has made richer with every episode and less resolved. Section 14. The Town of the Dead Deaths That Did and Didn't Count. One of the most peculiar features of the Family Guy universe is its relationship to death as a permanent condition. In most fictional universes, death means something. When a character dies, there are consequences. The narrative changes. The world is different. The absence is felt. Family Guy has, over its long run, developed an extremely fluid relationship with this principle, to the point where the question of whether any given death is real, durable, and meaningful has become genuinely difficult to answer. The show's most famous engagement with this question is, of course, the Brian storyline. A main character died. The show treated it with apparent sincerity. And then, 2 episodes later, the death was reversed through a time travel mechanism that had been established in earlier episodes. The reversal was done quickly, and with a certainty that suggested the writers had always intended it, that the death was a stunt designed to generate attention rather than a narrative choice with consequences. Fans were furious, or relieved, or both. But Brian is far from the only character who has died and returned. Stewie himself has died in multiple episodes across the show's run, most of which existed in the form of alternate timeline explorations or Elseworld-style one-offs, and he has returned each time with no permanent consequence. Peter has been in situations that should have killed him many times over, sustaining injuries that would be immediately lethal in any realistic framework, and bouncing back without apparent lasting damage. The same is true of Quagmire, Joe, Cleveland, and essentially every character in the show's universe. They can be hurt, catastrophically, temporarily, and then they are fine. This is, again, not unusual for an animated comedy. The cartoon physics tradition allows for this kind of resilience, because the story needs its characters to be available for the next episode. But Family Guy has occasionally tried to have it both ways, to treat some deaths as permanent and emotionally significant while treating others as temporary and comic, and the inconsistency between these modes is jarring in a specific way. The most persistent, unsolved mystery in this area is what happens to all the characters who have been killed by the show and then simply never mentioned again. People die in Family Guy, frequently. Background characters, minor recurring characters, people who have been established enough to have a name and a face and a brief history. And then they are gone, and the show moves on. And nobody who is still alive seems to particularly remember or mourn them in ways that persist beyond the episode of their death. The world does not hold on to its losses, it resets. But the losses were real, in the logic of the universe. The people who died were there. They existed. The physical fact of their death, the violence or accident or illness or absurdist circumstance that ended them, happened within the story. And the story does not keep any record of it. There is no memorial, there is no quahog that is different because these people are gone. The town absorbs each loss and continues without apparent scarring. What this produces, at scale, is a universe in which death exists as an event, but not as a condition. Characters can experience dying as something that happens to them. They cannot experience being dead as something that defines them or the world around them, because the narrative keeps resetting. Because the next episode is always another normal episode. Because permanence, of any kind, is what the show's format is structurally unable to accommodate. The mystery is not what happens when characters die. The mystery is what the show believes about death, or rather what its formal structure forces it to behave as though it believes. That death is not the end of something, but a kind of pause. That the world goes on with the same momentum it always had. That the absence of a person leaves a hole that is shaped exactly like the person, and that the narrative fills with the next episode, the next joke, the next adventure, as smoothly and as completely as water closes over a dropped stone. Section 15. The relationship between the Griffins and God. In several episodes across the show's run, characters from the Family Guy universe have had direct contact with God, not a vision of God, not a feeling of the divine or a spiritual experience that could be interpreted various ways. Actual, literal contact, conversations, interactions, moments where the God of the Family Guy universe shows up in physical form and behaves in ways that reveal something about the cosmological structure of the world these characters inhabit. The God of Family Guy is, in keeping with the show's general approach to the sacred, both unmistakably divine and unmistakably human. He is powerful in the absolute sense, capable of extraordinary things. He is also susceptible to social pressure, personal preference, bad decisions, and the specific kind of insecurity that expresses itself as occasional displays of power that are slightly too large for the situation. He is a character, fully rendered, with quirks and habits and a relationship to the human world that is more hands-on and more personal than most theological traditions would recognize. The show has also depicted Jesus, specifically as a recurring character who is essentially a celebrity, a figure of immense public recognition who navigates the same media landscape and social dynamics as everyone else. Jesus can do miracles. He can also be awkward at parties and uncertain about how to handle unexpected attention and susceptible to the same kinds of social anxieties that afflict the other characters in his world. What this cosmology implies is interesting. It implies a universe where the divine is not absent or unknowable, but simply another order of existence that occasionally intersects with the human world, usually at inconvenient moments, usually with results that are comic rather than transcendent. God made the world and he continues to be involved with it, but his involvement is the involvement of a being who has opinions and preferences and is sometimes surprised by how things turn out. This has consequences for the other mysteries of the show. If God exists, And is this involved in the world? Then the question of why the world is the way it is in the Family Guy universe takes on a different texture. Why does a talking dog exist? Because God's world is stranger than any specific theological tradition accounts for, and the strangeness is not distributed according to any principle that human beings can reliably identify. Why can time be manipulated by a 1-year-old with a machine? Because the universe's structure in the hands of this God has properties that the God himself may not have anticipated when he designed it. Why does death function the way it does in this world? Because death is a person, and persons are fallible, and the God who assigned the role apparently did not build in a failsafe. The show's universe has a God, but it does not have a plan. Or if it has a plan, the plan looks, from the inside, indistinguishable from no plan at all, which may be the closest the show ever gets to a genuine theological statement. Section 16. The Mystery of Chris Griffin, The Forgotten Puzzle. Chris Griffin is not usually discussed in the same breath as Stewie or Brian or Meg when people talk about the unresolved mysteries of the show. He is the middle child in the practical sense, the one whose presence is acknowledged and whose story is rarely centered, who drifts through the show's universe as a presence rather than a focus. He is large, amiable, not particularly intelligent, interested in art, and possessed of a quality that the show describes but never explains, which is that he is occasionally, and apparently without conscious effort, capable of genuinely profound and perceptive observations about the people around him. This happens sporadically but consistently enough across the show's run that it cannot be entirely accidental. In the middle of an otherwise standard comedic exchange, Chris will say something that cuts to the truth of a situation with a precision that none of the other characters manage. And then the show moves on, and the moment is never referenced again, and Chris goes back to being broadly comic, and the observation he made sits in the archive of the episode like something true that nobody quite noticed. There is a theory, not widely circulated but interesting, that Chris's apparent low intelligence is a performance, or an adaptation rather than a genuine cognitive limitation. That Chris, living in a household where his father's buffoonery has defined the family's emotional culture, has learned that being smart is not safe, is not rewarded, is not a trait that earns you love in this specific family structure. And so Chris has adopted the register of his father as a form of protection, as a way of fitting into a family system that has no comfortable place for genuine intelligence outside of the specific niche that Brian occupies. The moments of surprising perception are the moments when the adaptation slips. When something about the situation is clear enough that the person underneath the performance speaks before the performance can catch up. This is speculation. The show has never confirmed anything like this interpretation. But the raw material is there, across dozens of episodes, in the specific quality of the moments when Chris says something true. And the mystery of who Chris Griffin actually is, beneath the broad strokes of his established character, is one that the show has generated the evidence for without ever pursuing the question. Section 17. The question of Lois Pewter-Schmidt. Where did she come from? Lois Griffin, before she was a Griffin, was a Pewter-Schmidt. Her father, Carter Pewter-Schmidt, is one of the wealthiest men in New England, a figure of establishment power and old money, and the particular variety of casual cruelty that sometimes accompanies both. Her mother, Barbara Pewter-Schmidt, is a somewhat faded figure in the show's mythology. There, when needed, consistent enough in her depiction to feel like a real character without ever being the center of enough episodes to constitute a fully developed one. The mystery of Lois is the mystery of how someone who grew up in that environment, with that money and that social position and that family culture, ended up in a modest house in Quahog with a man like Peter Griffin. The show has addressed this in a general way through various backstory episodes that establish how Peter and Lois met, that they fell in love against her family's wishes, that Carter in particular disapproved of the match and has never fully reconciled himself to it. These are the broad strokes. But what is interesting is what the broad strokes do not explain. Lois is, by any reasonable assessment of her background, dramatically overqualified for the life she is living. She is intelligent, educated, from a family that had resources enough to give her any number of options. She chose Peter, and the choice is the show's foundational romantic mystery, the question that every subsequent episode exists inside. What does Lois see in Peter Griffin? The show's answer, when it gives one, tends to be something about Peter's essential warmth, his fundamental heart, The fact that beneath the chaos and the bad decisions and the self-destruction, there is something genuinely lovable about the man. And there are moments when the show earns this argument. When Peter does or says something that makes you see why someone could love him despite everything. But there are also vast stretches of the show's later seasons where the argument becomes very hard to sustain. What keeps Lois there? The early seasons have a cleaner answer. Love, genuine and mutual, even between imperfect people. The later seasons make the question sharper and leave it less resolved. Lois has built a life that is nothing like what her origins would have predicted, and the mystery of what she wanted from that building project, what she was moving toward, and what she was moving away from, is one that the show has circled without ever landing inside. She was, at some point in the show's backstory, living a different life. A party girl with different expectations, a woman before she was a wife and mother who wanted things she has largely set aside. The show brings this up occasionally, as material for episodes about Lois rediscovering some aspect of her former self, and then puts it away again. The former Lois is always there, in the background of the present Lois, and the relationship between those two versions of the same woman is a story the show keeps hinting at without telling. Section 18. Stewie's accent and what it reveals. We came back to Stewie. We were always going to come back to Stewie. He is the character the show was built around, in the sense that he was the most original creation, the one who made the show feel like something that could not have existed anywhere else, and his evolution across the seasons is the evolution of the show's relationship to its own ambition. What happened to Stewie is the story of what happened to Family Guy, in miniature. But the accent? The accent deserves its own section because it is stranger than it is usually given credit for. When Stewie revealed to the school counselor that his British accent is a fabrication, the show was doing something interesting. It was revealing that the character we have known, the precise and elaborate vocal performance that is one of the most recognizable things in the show, is itself a performance within the performance. There is a Stewie behind the Stewie, a quieter, less defined, less armored version of the same person who adopted the armor so long ago that the armor has become indistinguishable from the person. This is not an uncommon psychological situation. People develop voices, registers, ways of presenting themselves to the world that, over time, become so habitual that they can no longer locate the baseline they started from. The performance was always strategic, always defensive, always a response to the specific vulnerabilities of the person performing it. But the person keeps performing it long after the original need for the defense has changed, because the performance is now load-bearing, structural, the thing that holds the presented self together. Stewie performs sophistication and menace and razor wit because these are the things that make him feel in control of a world in which he is, objectively, completely powerless. He is a baby. He cannot walk out the door. He cannot drive. He cannot access food or shelter or freedom without the cooperation of the people who are technically his captors, however benevolent those captors might be in their better moments. The British accent and the elaborate vocabulary and the world domination schemes are all the same thing at their root. They are a way of feeling large when the physical reality of the situation is very small. The accent being fake does not mean Stewie is fake. It means that the way he presents himself is a chosen construction, which is true of most people who are paying attention to their own presentation. The mystery is not that he wears the mask. The mystery is what the mask was covering before he put it on, and whether there is still anything there to find. The episode ends with Stewie keeping the accent, by choice, because the alternative is being ordinary. And maybe that is the answer to the deepest version of the Stewie question. He is not British. He is not an evil genius in the operational sense. Not anymore. He is not the cold, calculating villain of the early seasons. He is a one-year-old baby who has decided to be something more interesting than that, who has constructed himself so thoroughly that the construction is now all there is, and he knows it, and he keeps going anyway. Section 19. The unsolved mystery of Brian's novel. For the entire run of the show, Brian Griffin has been working on a novel. This is one of the most consistent pieces of characterization in the show's history. The novel is always there. Always unfinished. Always the thing that Brian talks about and does not quite do. The project that represents his ambitions and his failures simultaneously. He drinks martinis. He talks about the novel. He does not finish the novel. This is his loop. The mystery is not whether Brian will finish the novel. The show has made very clear that finishing is not the point. The mystery is what the novel is actually about. In various episodes across the show's run, there are hints and references and brief descriptions of the novel's content, but none of them cohere into a clear picture. The novel seems to change, or the character's description of it changes, in ways that suggest either that the novel itself is evolving as Brian works on it, or that Brian's relationship to the project is so complicated that he cannot give a stable account of what it is. This is actually true to life. Writers, real ones, often cannot describe their work in progress clearly, not because they do not know what they are writing, but because the act of describing it forces it to take a shape that the work itself has not yet found. The novel lives in the space between language and reality, between what you mean and what you can say, and describing it too precisely collapses that space prematurely. Brian's novel is a mystery that functions as a portrait of creative aspiration in a state of permanent incompletion. The thing that he will spend his life not finishing is the thing that makes his life mean something to him, which is an arrangement many creative people recognize. The meaning is not in the finished product. The meaning is in the reaching. But the practical mystery remains. What is it about? What has Brian been trying to say, across all these years, in the book that is always being written and never being read? The show has never answered this, and it probably should not. Some things are more powerful as ongoing attempts than as completed objects. Section 20. The last question. After all of it, after the mysteries of who can hear Stewie and what Brian actually is, and who Meg's real father is, and why the chicken and Peter cannot stop fighting, and what Stewie's time machine actually did to the fabric of reality, and what happens to the dead and who God is in this universe, and what Lois wanted, and what Chris is hiding, and what the accent was covering, and what the novel is about, after all of that, the last question is the simplest and the most unanswerable. What does it mean to live in a story that keeps going? The Griffin family has been in this story for more than 25 years. The world has changed around them while they stayed approximately the same, aging in the slow, non-linear way that animated characters age, which is to say barely at all. They have had adventures that were forgotten, and crises that were resolved, and deaths that were undone, and fights that were repeated, and questions that were raised and dropped and raised again. They have been terrible to each other, and genuinely warm with each other, and everything in between. They have been badly written and brilliantly written, and written with no coherent plan at all. And they are still there. The Griffin house is still there, in its impossible geography, its variable floor plan, its front lawn that has been the site of events that should have changed everything and somehow changed nothing. The drunken clam is still there. The bar stools are occupied by the same people who occupied them in 1999, with more miles on them and no more wisdom and exactly the same capacity for love and destruction that they have always had. The mysteries do not resolve in a story that keeps going. They accumulate, they layer, they become part of the texture of the universe, questions that you carry with you through every episode, that make familiar things strange and strange things familiar. Why can Stewie build a time machine? Why does Brian exist? Who is Stan Thompson? What is Ernie really fighting for? You are not going to get the answers. Not tonight, maybe not ever. But the questions are beautiful, and the night is long, and there is nowhere you need to be. Stay here for a while. The show keeps going. The house is lit. The baby is planning something in the room at the top of the stairs, and the dog is at the kitchen counter, and somewhere in the impossible town of Quahog, a giant chicken has one eye open, waiting. Sleep well. The mysteries will be here when you wake up. If this helped you drift off tonight, or if you just enjoyed the ride, please hit subscribe and leave a like. And drop a comment with a mystery we missed, or a theory you believe in, or just where you are and what time it is. I read every single one. Thank you for being here. End of script. Section 21. The Mystery of Herbert. What is his actual story? There is a character who lives across the street from the Griffins, an elderly man with a creaking voice and a particular fondness for young boys, specifically Chris, that the show has always coded as something darker than simple, neighborly warmth. His name is Herbert. He is one of the most recurring secondary characters in the show's history. He moves slowly, he speaks in a thin, reedy voice that sounds like it takes genuine effort to produce, and every scene he is in operates under a layer of deeply uncomfortable dramatic irony that the show has always played for laughs without ever resolving into anything like a coherent story about who he actually is. Because here is the thing. Herbert, despite being one of the show's most frequently referenced secondary characters, is almost entirely unexplained. We know his first name, his general appearance, and his surface-level obsession with Chris. We do not know his last name, though it has been suggested in one episode to be Van Minkle, but this has never been confirmed. We do not know where he came from before he lived in this neighborhood. We do not know what he did for a living, what his life looked like before the events of the show, or who he was to the people around him before the Griffins moved in and Chris became the object of his unhealthy attention. What we do know, from a standpoint of actual in-universe information, is that Herbert is a veteran of World War II. This has been confirmed in at least one episode, where Herbert is shown in flashback or referenced in connection with military service, and it gives the character an age that makes him extraordinary in the context of the show. If Herbert served in World War II as an adult, he is at minimum in his late 80s or more likely his 90s by the time the main events of the show take place. He is among the oldest human beings in the Griffin neighborhood, possibly the oldest, and the war he served in was one of the most significant events in human history. This background sits in complete silence behind everything else about Herbert. The show has never explored what Herbert's life looked like between the end of that war and the present of the show, 70 years give or take. A whole life lived in the interior of a person who has been reduced, in the show's treatment, to a single disturbing character note. He is a veteran of extraordinary historical events and a human being of advanced age with an entire history behind him, and the show uses him exclusively as a recurring gag. There is also the dog. Herbert has a dog named Jessie, an elderly basset hound who moves with even greater difficulty than Herbert does, who has been depicted in a few episodes as Herbert's companion and emotional anchor. The relationship between Herbert and Jessie is one of the more quietly touching things the show has accidentally produced. Two very old beings, both slow, both limited, both near the end of their natural span, navigating a world that has moved very far past the world they understood when they were young. Jessie's eventual death, depicted in one episode, is handled with a genuine emotional weight that the show does not always manage for its human characters. The Jessie episode is revealing because it shows that Herbert is capable of love, of the specific, sustained, loyal love that comes from a long relationship with another being. He loved Jessie with a simplicity and completeness that his other habits do not suggest he is capable of. And that human capacity, that warmth, that evident grief, sits next to the other things the show shows us about him in a way that is not comfortable. The show does not resolve this discomfort. It presents the warmth and the discomfort simultaneously and lets the audience hold both without a verdict. The mystery of Herbert is partly the mystery of how a person becomes who they are. What sequence of events and choices and circumstances produces a person this specific and this strange? There is a whole life behind this character that the show has never told and is not going to tell. There was a young man who went to war in 1941 or 1942, who survived something that killed millions of other people, who came home to a country that was beginning a different kind of life, who built some version of an existence across the decades between then and the present of the show. What that existence looked like, who he loved, what he lost, what he built and watched fall apart, who he was in the decades when he was neither young nor old but simply a person in the middle of his life, all of that is permanently dark. We only have the end of the story, and even the end has been reduced to a single recurring joke. Herbert is a mystery that the show created by only ever showing one dimension of a person who, by the mathematics of his own age, must have had many. Section 22. The Pewter-Schmidt Dynasty. How rich is the family really? Carter Pewter-Schmidt, Lois's father, is one of the wealthiest men in New England. This is established early in the show's run and reinforced constantly. Carter's wealth is not just background detail. It is a structural feature of the show's universe, the economic counterpoint to Peter's working-class existence, the tension between where Lois came from and where she chose to go, the source of 100 different comedic situations involving Peter's inadequacy in the face of Carter's resources, and Carter's social contempt for everything Peter represents. But the mystery of the Pewter-Schmidt wealth, its actual scale, its source, its maintenance, is something the show has never examined with any care. Carter is rich, very rich, generationally, embarrassingly rich. He has a compound in Newport. He has staff. He has institutions named after him. He has the specific imperious quality of someone who has never had to ask permission for anything and cannot quite believe that other people routinely do. He is, in the world of the show, a figure of such extreme economic power that his decisions affect not just his own family but the community around him in ways that the show depicts casually and never investigates. Where did the money come from? The show has offered passing references to Pewter Schmidt Industries and to the family's business interests, but has never established clearly what those interests are, how long they have been in operation, or what their relationship is to the old money establishment of the New England region. Is Carter the first Pewter Schmidt of significant wealth, or is he the inheritor of wealth accumulated over several generations? The show implies a certain antiquity to the family's position, a sense that the money has been there long enough to produce the particular kind of confidence that only time can generate. The relationship between Carter's wealth and the political and social structures around it is also largely unexplored. A man of Carter's apparent resources, in a real American context, would have connections to political power, would be a donor to campaigns and causes, would have a relationship to the institutions of the state that people without his resources do not have. The show has touched on this occasionally, with Carter using his wealth to smooth things over or create advantages for himself and his family, but it has never examined what this actually means in the texture of the world the Griffins inhabit. And then there is the question of Lois's inheritance. As Carter's daughter, as presumably his primary heir given that the show has not established other close relatives who would complicate the succession, Lois stands to inherit an extraordinary amount of money at some point. The show has used this as a plot device in various episodes, threatening to cut Lois off, or suggesting that she has already chosen to separate herself from the Pewter Schmidt wealth, but the actual mechanics of the inheritance have never been laid out clearly. If Lois inherited even a portion of what Carter's estate represents, the Griffin family's financial situation would be transformed completely. The show's premise, the working-class family in the modest house, would be unsustainable. The premise requires that the wealth remain always at a distance, always conditionally available, never actually absorbed into the Griffin family's daily reality. And so, the show maintains this distance without ever establishing the rules that govern it. The Pewter Schmidt fortune is a mystery of scale and origin and eventual destination. Carter is very old, by the show's own chronology, and the question of what happens to everything he has built when he is gone is one the show has raised and sidestepped dozens of times. Lois is his daughter. The money presumably goes somewhere. The show has never decided where, and the decision, whenever it is made, will change the Griffin family's story completely. Section 23. The Mystery of Joe Swanson. The full story of the chair. Joe Swanson is in a wheelchair. He has been since before the events of the show, or at least since the beginning of the show's continuity, and the story of how he came to be in that wheelchair has been told at least twice in ways that are mutually contradictory. This is one of the clearest examples of the show's complicated relationship with its own canon. Joe is established as a police officer, a decorated one, a man of genuine courage and competence and physical capability who is put in a wheelchair by an event in the line of duty. The specifics of that event have changed at least twice in the show's narrative. In the first version, told in an early episode, Joe was injured pursuing a criminal. The details are specific enough to feel like an official origin story. In a much later episode, a different version of events is told, contradicting key details of the first. The show has treated this contradiction with the characteristic lightness it brings to all continuity problems, which is to say it has not treated it at all. The contradiction exists. Both versions are in the archive. The show does not acknowledge the discrepancy, but the contradiction is interesting beyond just being a continuity error, because it suggests something about the show's understanding of Joe as a character. If his origin story can be changed without the show noticing or caring, then his origin is not actually the point. The point is not how he got there. The point is where he is now, what it means to be a man of Joe's capabilities and temperament and professional identity living in the specific physical situation he inhabits. Joe is one of the more complex characters the show has ever produced when it is paying attention to him. He is strong, in ways that go beyond the physical. He is determined to occupy the same social and professional space that he occupied before his injury, not as an accommodation but as an insistence that nothing fundamental about who he is has changed. He is also, at various points in the show's run, a man who is clearly struggling with what his injury means in his marriage, in his friendships, in his understanding of himself. These struggles are real and have produced some of the show's more emotionally honest episodes, but the origin mystery is real. There is a version of Joe's story that is the true one. If the show's universe has a single true version, and the show has offered two different accounts of it, the question of which one to believe, or whether either one is accurate, or whether the show is actually trying to say something through the contradiction rather than simply having made an error, is genuinely unanswerable. And there is a deeper question underneath the origin question. Joe is a police officer in Quahog, which is a town where the rule of law operates in ways that are at best approximate. Things happen in that town. Terrible things, absurd things, things that by any reasonable standard should produce significant law enforcement response. Joe is present for many of these things. He is sometimes part of them. His relationship to his professional role as the town's defender and to the actual events of the town, which frequently make his professional role look ceremonial rather than functional, is one of the show's ongoing tensions that never resolves into a clear statement. Joe believes in the law. He has organized his entire identity around the law, around the authority and responsibility that his badge represents. He has also lived in Quahog long enough to know that the law in Quahog is an approximation at best and a fiction at worst. What does a man do with that knowledge? What does Joe Swanson do with the gap between what his profession is supposed to mean and what it actually accomplishes in the specific context of this specific town? The show does not answer this. Joe is funny and he is loyal and he is occasionally genuinely moving. The mystery of his interior life, the life of a man who has organized himself around a vocation and a physical condition and a set of friendships that do not always reflect well on him, is a mystery the show keeps generating and never resolves. Section 24. The mystery of Peter's intelligence. How dim is he actually? Peter Griffin, by the internal evidence of the show across its entire run, operates at an intelligence level that varies so dramatically between episodes that no consistent assessment of his cognitive capacity is possible. In some episodes, he is capable of basic strategic thinking, of remembering complicated information, of navigating social situations with a rudimentary but functional competence. In others, he is incapable of things that most adults with standard cognitive function manage without effort. This is one of the show's most discussed inconsistencies, and it is worth dwelling on because the inconsistency is not just a continuity problem. It reflects a genuine ambiguity about who Peter is. The show was built on Peter as a lovable fool, a man whose stupidity was the source of a specific kind of comedy that requires the fool to be dumb enough to get into trouble, but smart enough to have genuine relationships, and to sometimes, in his fumbling way, do the right thing. That version of Peter requires a specific band of intelligence, dumb in comedic ways, but not impaired in ways that make him unable to function. The later seasons pushed Peter's intelligence lower and lower without maintaining the balance. The result is a Peter who is sometimes depicted as being so profoundly limited that his capacity to hold a job, maintain a marriage, and raise children becomes genuinely implausible rather than comedically implausible. And then in the same run of episodes, there will be a moment where Peter displays a competence or a self-awareness or a strategic capability that completely contradicts the established floor. The theory that makes the most sense of this, that is not just an excuse for inconsistent writing but actually corresponds to something real, is that Peter's intelligence is highly context-dependent. He is not uniformly dumb. He is dumb in specific ways and capable in others. And the specific ways he is dumb map onto the specific things the show needs him to be unable to do in a given episode. He cannot understand consequences. In general, he cannot maintain attention on anything that does not immediately reward his attention. He cannot navigate complex social dynamics without causing damage. But he can also, in moments that seem to catch him off guard, say something true, do something kind, find a solution that his more apparently capable friends missed. This is not an incoherent picture of a person. This is actually how intelligence works in a lot of human beings, in uneven ways that do not conform to a simple scale. The mystery is whether the show knows this. Whether the inconsistency in Peter's intelligence is deliberate rather than accidental, whether there is a coherent portrait underneath the variable depictions, or simply a character who has been written by too many different writers with too many different ideas about who he is. There is also the question of what Peter would be if he were smarter. The show has played with alternate versions of Peter in various episodes, including versions where he has been presented with situations that force a level of competence he does not normally demonstrate. In those moments, something interesting emerges. A Peter who is capable of more is not necessarily a Peter who is better off. The particular shape of his life, the specific combination of people and circumstances that constitute his existence, emerged from the specific shape of his limitations. Change the limitations and you change everything downstream of them. Who would Peter Griffin be if he were 10 points of IQ higher? 15? The show has never answered this, but the question implies something about the relationship between who a person is and what they are capable of, about whether intelligence is an advantage or simply a different configuration of the same raw material. Section 25. The Mystery of the Drunken Clam. What holds it together? The Drunken Clam is the most important location in the show that is not the Griffin house. It is where Peter, Joe, and Quagmire go to drink, to commiserate, to plan badly, to recover from the consequences of plans that were worse. It is the gravitational center of the male social world in the show, the place where the adult friendships that structure Peter's life outside his home are maintained and occasionally strained and usually restored. It is owned, for most of the show's run, by a man named Jerome, after being previously owned by a man named Horace, who died in an episode that the show treated as genuinely sad for perhaps 10 minutes before Jerome took over, and the bar continued as if it had always been this way. The transition from Horace to Jerome produced an episode with some genuine emotional weight, specifically around the theme of the places that anchor us and how we respond when those places change, and then the show moved on. The Drunken Clam has survived catastrophes that should have destroyed it. It has been damaged, flooded, reconceived, and continued. It has served as the backdrop for 100 different conversations and has maintained its essential identity across all of those contexts. But the mystery of the Drunken Clam is not really about the bar itself. It is about what the bar does, what function it serves in the social ecosystem of the Griffin household and the broader community. It is the place where the male characters go to not be at home, which is a specific and human need that the show understands without ever naming it directly. The bar is the space between the demands of work and the demands of family, between the person Peter has to be in other contexts and the person he is comfortable being here. It is where the friendships that sustain him are maintained at a low temperature, through proximity and shared ritual, through the simple act of sitting in the same place week after week and drinking. The unanswered question of the Drunken Clam is what it means that this is where Peter goes when he needs to be himself. That the place where he is most at ease is a bar, rather than his own house. The show has occasionally acknowledged this as a problem, as a symptom of Peter's avoidance of the genuine demands of domestic life. But more often it treats the bar as simple fun, as the setting for comedy, without asking what it says about the character that this is his primary social habitat. Who would Peter be without the Drunken Clam? Who would his friendships be without the shared ritual of the bar? These are questions about what holds people together in adulthood when the natural social structures of school and neighborhood and early career have fallen away, and what remains is whatever you have deliberately chosen to maintain. Peter has chosen this bar and these men and this ritual. The choice reveals something. The show has never quite said what. Section 26. The Mystery of the Golden Ticket Episodes, Meta-Narrative and What It Reveals. Family Guy is a show that breaks its own fourth wall with increasing frequency as the seasons progress. Characters reference the show they are in. They make jokes about the writers, about Fox, about the quality of their own recent seasons. They speak to the audience directly. They acknowledge that they are characters in a television program with a production schedule and a network relationship and an audience that has opinions about them. This is not unusual for a comedy of this type. The Simpsons did it. South Park does it constantly. The self-awareness is part of the genre, a way of managing the inevitable artificiality of a fictional universe by making that artificiality part of the joke. If you acknowledge that you are a cartoon before the audience can hold it against you, you have converted a potential liability into a feature. But in Family Guy's case, the self-referential moments have become so frequent and so pointed that they constitute their own kind of mystery. When a character looks at the camera and makes a joke about the show's declining quality, what is actually being communicated? Is the show performing self-deprecation as a defensive move, inoculating itself against criticism by getting there first? Is it genuinely trying to acknowledge a problem it has no intention of fixing? Is it using the meta-joke as a substitute for the actual work of improving? The answer is probably some combination of all of these. And the fact that there is no clean single answer makes the meta-commentary its own kind of mystery. A show that makes jokes about being bad is doing something. The something is not nothing, but it is also not the same as actually addressing the problem the jokes are about. It is a third option, a way of being in relationship with a criticism without either rejecting it or responding to it. There is a specific category of episode that falls into this territory. Episodes that are explicitly about Family Guy being a television show that take the meta-awareness so far that the fictional universe and the production reality of the show are collapsed into each other. These episodes are usually among the most ambitious the show produces and the most difficult to evaluate, because they are doing something that does not quite have a precedent and that the show itself does not have a stable critical vocabulary for. The mystery is what the show believes about itself. The episodes that most clearly ask this question are the ones that have no clean answer. Is Family Guy aware of what it has become? Does the awareness change anything? If a person knows they are making a mistake and makes it anyway, and makes a joke about making it, and keeps making it, what does that tell you about the relationship between self-knowledge and change? This is not a mystery about the characters. It is a mystery about the show's relationship to its own history and to its audience. And it is one that the show cannot answer from the inside. Section 27. The Mystery of Bonnie Swanson, The Years in the Chair. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, was pregnant for what is widely recognized as one of the longest pregnancies in the history of television. For approximately 9 seasons, Bonnie was visibly pregnant. The baby she was carrying, Kevin, eventually arrived. And the arrival was treated as an event the show acknowledged had taken an absurdly long time by any realistic measure. The show made jokes about it. The pregnancy was so extended that it became a running gag, a piece of the show's internal mythology that fans recognized and the writers leaned into. But the mystery of Bonnie is not really about the pregnancy, as remarkable as its duration was. The mystery of Bonnie is about her relationship with Joe and with the life that relationship has produced. Bonnie, in the early seasons of the show, was depicted as a woman in a difficult situation who handled it with a particular grace and warmth. She was loyal to Joe. She supported him. She believed in the marriage and in the person she had married. Over the course of the later seasons, that warmth curdled slightly. Bonnie became more visibly frustrated, more willing to express the specific kind of resentment that builds in a marriage where one partner feels that they have given more than they have received. Episodes explored her dissatisfaction, her fantasies about a different kind of life, her relationship to Joe's limitations and her own. She was, at various points, depicted as being on the edge of leaving, of choosing a different path, and then drawn back into the marriage by something that was not always clearly articulated. The mystery of Bonnie Swanson is the mystery of all long marriages, which is that the people inside them are always slightly different from the people who entered them, and the marriage itself is a living thing that changes as its participants change, and the question of whether to stay or go is never fully resolved. Even when you stay, Bonnie stays. That is the narrative answer. But the story underneath that answer, the story of what it has cost her and what she has decided it is worth, is a story the show has generated the materials for without ever fully telling. Section 28. The dark matter of the show, things that happened and were forgotten. There is a category of event in Family Guy's history that is more disturbing than any specific mystery or unanswered question, because it is not a question at all. It is an answer that has been given and then had the question removed from around it, leaving the answer floating in the canon without a frame. These are the things that happened in the show and were then forgotten. Not retconned, not reversed, not acknowledged as mistakes. Simply forgotten, treated as if they had never occurred, not through any narrative mechanism but through the simple passage of time and the assumption that the audience would not keep track. The scope of this is genuinely astonishing when you begin to catalog it. Characters who appeared in episodes and then vanished without explanation. Story developments that should have changed the Griffin family permanently and were never referenced again. Moments of violence, of tragedy, of genuine consequence that left no trace in the episodes that followed them. The show's universe is full of events that occurred and were then erased from the universe's own memory. This is different from the time travel reversals, where the narrative at least acknowledges that something is being undone. This is simpler and stranger. Things happen. The next episode begins. The things that happened are not there anymore. Not in anyone's memory, not in the physical environment, not in the emotional tone of the characters who experienced them. They happened and they did not happen, simultaneously, and the show holds both states without apparent discomfort. The mystery here is what this does to the texture of the universe. If events can happen and then not happen without any mechanism of reversal, then the universe itself is unreliable in a way that goes beyond comedic flexibility. It suggests that the fabric of the reality the characters inhabit is genuinely porous, that what is true at one moment is not necessarily true at the next, that the continuity of their world is being maintained by something other than the laws of cause and effect that govern most fictional universes. This is either the show's deepest creative failure or its most interesting structural feature, depending on how charitable you are feeling. But it raises a question that neither reading fully resolves. In a universe where events are routinely forgotten, where consequences do not accumulate, where the characters wake up in every episode in approximately the same state they were in at the beginning of the previous one, what does it mean to say that anything matters? If the things that happen do not leave a mark, then in what sense are they real? And if they are not real, in that sense, then what is the show actually depicting when it depicts them? This is the void at the center of the show's narrative structure. Not a mystery with a solution, but a condition that the show has built around itself, a permanent present tense, in which the past is always already erased and the future is always approximately the same as now. Section 29. The mystery of why we keep watching. After all of the mysteries, after the questions that have no answers, the threads that have been dropped, the characters whose depths have been suggested but never fully explored, the universe whose rules are fluid and whose geography is impossible and whose continuity is maintained by selective forgetting, after all of that, why do we keep watching? This is a genuine question, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before the answer arrives, because the answer is interesting and says something about what storytelling actually does in the lives of people who consume it. The most honest answer is something like this. The mysteries are not incidental to the show's appeal. They are constitutive of it. The show does not produce attachment despite its unresolved questions. It produces attachment through them. A story with no questions is a story with no air in it. You need the questions, the open spaces, the places where meaning could be but has not been definitively placed in order for a story to feel alive. The resolution of every mystery is the death of the engagement. As long as there are things you do not know, there is a reason to keep paying attention. Family Guy has given its audience an extraordinary number of reasons to keep paying attention, not because it is always good or always thoughtful or always living up to what it was in its best seasons, but because it has created a world that has genuinely open edges. The Griffin House has rooms you have not visited. The history of Quahog goes further back than any episode has shown. The characters have lives that extend beyond the episodes, dimensions that have been implied but never illuminated. The story is bigger than what you have seen of it. That is not a failure. That is the condition that makes long-running storytelling possible. The audience stays because the map is not complete. They stay because somewhere in the archive of 500 episodes there might be, in a scene they half remember or never found or somehow missed, the thread that ties something together, or there might not. And the question of which it is keeps them watching. You are watching because the world of this show, for all its chaos and inconsistency and occasional creative exhaustion, feels like a place. Not a real place, obviously. Not a coherent place, by any rigorous geometric standard, but a place with the specific quality that the best fictional worlds have, which is the quality of being larger than any single telling of it, of having a depth that exceeds the story's own surface. That is the final mystery. Not how the show does it, not what the specific mechanism is that produces this feeling, just the fact that it does. That a collection of animated characters in an impossible town on the eastern seaboard of a fictional Rhode Island, living lives that do not follow the laws of physics or continuity or consequence, has produced something that people return to, late at night, looking for something that they might not be able to name, but that they recognize when they find it. The light is on in the Griffin House. It is always on. Whatever time it is where you are, whatever has happened in your day, the house is lit, and the people inside it are having arguments that have been going on for 25 years and will be going on for 25 more. The baby is planning something. The dog is at the kitchen counter. The man of the house is doing something inadvisable for reasons that will never quite hold up to examination. And somewhere in the neighborhood, a giant chicken is getting to his feet again. The mysteries remain. They always remain. And tomorrow night, you will come back to them. Section 30. One last thing, the mystery of the show itself. Family Guy premiered on the 31st of January 1999. The world it entered was a different world. The entertainment landscape was different. The cultural conversation about animation and about what primetime television could be was different. The network that aired it was in a different configuration. The creator was a young man in his mid-20s who had studied animation in Rhode Island and had made 2 short films about a man and his dog, and had somehow talked a major broadcast network into giving him a chance. 25 years later, more than 400 episodes, a cancellation and a revival, and then another near cancellation, and then a decade of declining ratings and a multi-season renewal that extends the show into its 30th anniversary. A show that began with 22 million viewers watching the premiere and has continued with a fraction of that, watched by people who mostly find it through streaming rather than broadcast, who encounter it as an archive rather than as a current event. The mystery of Family Guy, the one that sits behind all the in-universe mysteries, is the mystery of what it means for something to survive this long, what it costs, what it preserves, and what it sacrifices. The show that exists today is connected to the show that premiered in 1999 by a chain of continuity that has been maintained through cancellations and revivals and writers' strikes and changing creative leadership and 25 years of cultural change that would have been unrecognizable to the version of itself that started. What is the relationship between the show that is broadcasting now and the show that captured something real about a particular moment in American comedy at the end of the 20th century? Are they the same show? Can a show be the same show across that distance? The characters share names and voices and general outlines of personality. The setting is the same in its impossible, flexible way. The format is the same, but the thing that made the original show feel alive, the specific creative energy that the early seasons had, is harder to locate in the later ones. This is true of many things that last a long time. People, institutions, relationships, cities. They maintain their names and their general outlines, while the substance inside them shifts and changes and sometimes becomes something nearly unrecognizable to anyone who knew them at the beginning. The continuity is formal. The identity underneath is always in motion. The mystery of Family Guy is the mystery of identity across time. Of what a thing is when it has been many different things. Of whether the name on the door is an accurate description of what is inside. Of whether the unbroken chain of episodes from 1999 to today constitutes a single story or simply a very long series of stories that happen to share certain recurring elements. The audience, the one watching right now wherever you are, is the last piece of the mystery. You are watching this show because something about it matters to you, because it does something for you that other things do not do, because it has a place in your experience that it has earned through some combination of familiarity and surprise and genuine feeling, and the specific comfort of returning to something known. What the show is to you is different from what it is to the person next to you. That is true of all stories, of course. But it is especially true of a story this long and this contradictory and this imperfect and this genuinely inventive in moments and this genuinely exhausted in others. You have made your own peace with the gaps and the inconsistencies and the unanswered questions. You have brought your own answers to the places where the show offered none. That is what a living story does. It gives you the questions and lets you carry them. It provides the house, the neighborhood, the impossible geography, the characters with their unresolved interiors, and it leaves room for you to do the rest. The mysteries of Family Guy are yours now. You have been living inside them for as long as you have been watching the show, and you will carry them with you for as long as you can. The house is always lit. The questions are always there. The night is long and quiet and exactly right for sitting with the things you will never quite know. Sleep well. The show will still be here when you wake up. Thank you, genuinely, for spending this time here. If you have made it this far, please hit subscribe and leave a comment below. Tell me which mystery got its hooks into you the deepest. Tell me what you think about Stewie's voice, or Brian's true nature, or whether Stan Thompson will ever appear on screen. Tell me your theories. I read every single one, and some of the best lore I have encountered has come from people in the comments who noticed something I missed entirely. Take care of yourselves out there. Good night. End of full script. Bonus section. The mystery of recurring background characters who runs Quahog. There is a layer of the show's universe that most viewers pass through without pausing to examine, but that rewards close attention with an extraordinary richness of implied story. Behind the main characters, the show has populated its world with a constellation of recurring background characters who appear in episode after episode, whose presence gives Quahog the texture of a real community rather than a set, and whose lives are almost entirely unexplored despite the regularity of their appearances. Among these, the most persistent mystery belongs to a cluster of characters who appear in the social and civic structures of the town. The mayor, the various townspeople who show up at meetings and rallies and events, the regulars at the Drunken Clam who are never Peter, and never Joe, and never Quagmire, the people who form the community around the Griffins without ever fully entering their story. The show's universe has, in various episodes, made it clear that Quahog has an active civic life. There are local politics, local institutions, local controversies that mobilize the community. The townspeople respond to events with the particular energy of people who have strong opinions about where they live. They form mobs and committees and action groups and neighborhood watches. They are, collectively, a character in their own right, a social body that the Griffin family exists within and occasionally disrupts, but individually they are mysteries. The man who appears at every community meeting, who has been visible in the background of dozens of episodes, who has clearly been a resident of Quahog for decades, what is his story? The woman who appears in crowd scenes with such regularity that she has been noticed and cataloged by attentive fans, who is she to the town that needs her present for every collective moment? The regulars at the Drunken Clam who watch Peter and his friends from other tables, who share the same social space but have never been invited into the main narrative? What are their lives like when the camera is not on the main characters? These people, the hundreds of background presences that give the show's world its density, are the most thoroughly mysterious population in Quahog. They have been there longer than we have, in most cases. They watch the Griffin family arrive and establish themselves and disrupt the peace of the neighborhood and apologize and do it again. They have context for things we do not have context for. They remember versions of Quahog that predated our access to it. And the show has never given any of them a full story, because to give any one of them a full story would be to acknowledge that the world of the show extends far beyond the Griffins, that the Griffin family is one family in a world full of families, all of them equally real, all of them equally worthy of being followed. The show cannot do this. It was built around the Griffins, and following it to its logical conclusion would require dissolving the premise. So the background characters remain in the background, present and opaque, and as real as the production allows them to be without becoming protagonists. They are the deepest mystery of the show's universe, in a certain sense. Not because their individual stories are particularly strange or complicated, but because the fact of their existence at all implies a world that is as large and as dense and as full of unexamined lives as any actual neighborhood, and the show has built toward that implication for 25 years without ever following through on it. Bonus section. The mystery of the episode that went nowhere. Loose threads from across the series. In the archive of 400-plus episodes of Family Guy, there are dozens of narrative threads that were introduced and then quietly abandoned. Not the major character arcs or the ongoing relationships, but the specific episode-level stories that introduce something new into the universe and then never revisited it. These are the loose threads of the show, the places where the fabric is visibly incomplete, and they constitute their own kind of mystery. There is the ongoing question of Peter's sister. She was introduced in a Season 14 episode in a context that revealed significant backstory about Peter's childhood and about the cycle of abuse that runs through his family. The episode used this revelation to produce a genuine emotional moment between Peter and Meg. And then the sister essentially disappeared from the narrative. Her existence and the backstory it revealed left hanging in the air without any subsequent engagement. There is the matter of Brian's son Dylan, a recurring character from a handful of episodes who was established as Brian's biological offspring from a relationship before the events of the show. Dylan appeared, had a relationship with Brian, and then faded from the show's attention with the same indifference the narrative brings to all the threads it has finished with for now. There are the various Griffin family members who have appeared in single episodes and then never returned. Extended family has been implied to exist throughout the show's run, people whose relationship to Peter and Lois suggests a whole social world that occasionally surfaces and then submerges again. There is the matter of Stewie's nemesis, Bertram, who featured prominently in several episodes and whose time travel story arc produced one of the more genuinely interesting pieces of mythology in the show's history. Bertram, as Stewie's half-brother and as the show's most elaborate supervillain for a brief period, created complications that the show introduced and then set aside. His story is technically unfinished. The loose threads are not a failure of the show in isolation. Every long-running television narrative accumulates them. The writer's room moves faster than the continuity department can track, and the episodic format produces more beginnings than a coherent story can always provide endings for. But in Family Guy's case, the loose threads are so numerous, and some of them are so substantial, that they have become their own piece of the show's mythology. There is a Family Guy that exists in the gaps between episodes, a story made of everything the show has implied and not told, and it is in certain ways more interesting than the story the show has explicitly told. Bonus section: Final thoughts on mysteries and why they matter. The appeal of mystery, at its most basic, is the appeal of incompleteness. We are drawn to things that are not finished, to stories with spaces in them, to pictures with missing pieces. This is not a flaw in human perception. It is a feature of the way stories work for us, of the way narrative operates as a cognitive and emotional tool. A complete story, one with no ambiguity and no unresolved questions, is a story that is over. And something in us resists the overness of stories, especially stories that have mattered to us. Family Guy has given its audience an extraordinary amount of incompleteness across 25 years. Not all of it has been deliberate. Some of it is the natural byproduct of a production process that prioritizes the immediate comedic and narrative demands of individual episodes over the long-term coherence of a shared universe. Some of it is the result of the show having multiple different creative teams with different interests and priorities over its history. Some of it is genuinely and deliberately ambiguous, designed to keep the audience curious, to provide the open spaces that allow a story to breathe. But all of it, deliberate or accidental, intentional or not, has produced a universe that feels genuinely lived in. Not in the polished, internally consistent way that the most rigorously constructed fictional worlds feel lived in, but in the messier, truer way that actual life feels lived in. Real life has loose threads. Real life has questions that go unanswered for decades. Real life has people whose backstories are only partially known, whose interiors are guessed at rather than witnessed, whose motivations are inferred from behavior that does not always cohere into a simple explanation. The Griffin family is a mystery, at every level from the biographical to the cosmological. And we keep watching, in part because we keep hoping to understand them a little better. Because each new episode offers the possibility, however small, that something will click into place, that a question that has been sitting open for years will finally receive its answer. And in part, we keep watching because we have learned that the questions themselves are the company we wanted. This is what stories do at their best. They give us people to wonder about. They give us worlds to inhabit in the imagination, places we can return to in the quiet of the night when the day is done and the demands of our own lives have briefly stepped back. They give us mysteries that are not ours to solve, but that are somehow ours to carry. The baby is still there, in his room, planning things in the dark. The dog is still at the kitchen counter, staring into the middle distance, thinking about his unfinished novel and his unanswered questions. The family is still assembled in the same impossible house, in the same impossible town, living the same story that has been running for longer than most stories run. You know where to find them. They will be there every time you need them. Good night. Rest well. And thank you, from the bottom of this channel, for being here. Total script end. Extended section. The mythology of Stewie's bedroom laboratory. There is a room in the Griffin house that should not exist. It is Stewie's bedroom. Not because a 1-year-old having his own room is unusual, although the show has been inconsistent about the floor plan in ways we have discussed, but because of what is in it. The weapons, the machines, the inventions, the things that Stewie has built and stored and operated and hidden from the adults in his household for as long as the show has been running. The bedroom functions as a kind of TARDIS of the Griffin house, a space that is physically small and visually consistent with a child's room in its general outlines, but that contains multitudes. Ray guns, time machines at various points, mind control devices, weather-altering equipment, escape tunnels, surveillance systems, The accumulated technological output of a genius who has been working in a space that the adults in his household either cannot access or choose not to investigate. This is one of the show's most consistently maintained pieces of world building. Episode after episode, across the entire run of the show, Stewie's bedroom operates as a kind of secret laboratory that the narrative treats as simply given. Nobody explains how he built any of it. Nobody explains where the materials came from. Nobody explains how a one-year-old child, however intelligent, managed to acquire and assemble technology that appears, in several cases, to be decades or centuries ahead of current human capability. The show does not explain this because to explain it would be to acknowledge that it is impossible, and to acknowledge that it is impossible would be to undermine the premise that the bedroom laboratory operates on, which is that Stewie's genius simply is that it produces results that cannot be accounted for by any realistic assessment of his situation, and that this is a fact about the universe of the show that must be accepted without a mechanism. But the mystery of how Stewie builds his inventions connects to a larger mystery about the physics of intelligence in the show's universe. Stewie is brilliant in a way that exceeds anything his circumstances should be capable of producing. He is a baby. His brain is still developing in the literal biological sense. His fine motor skills are those of a one-year-old. His access to materials and tools and educational resources is entirely dependent on the adults around him who are, collectively, not providing anything that would explain the output. One possibility, which the show has never raised but which follows logically from the CIA experiment theory applied to Stewie rather than Brian, is that Stewie is not simply a naturally occurring intelligent baby but a product of something external. Something that gave him capabilities that natural development could not explain. The British accent that he describes as a chosen affectation might itself be part of a designed persona. The evil genius template, the specific shape his intelligence takes, might be the result of a shaping process that the show has never depicted because it predates the events of the narrative. On this reading, Stewie's bedroom laboratory is not an impossibility. It is evidence of a capability that was built in, that was there from the beginning, that the show's universe treats as simply given because from within the universe's frame of reference, it is. The mystery is not how Stewie builds these things. The mystery is what made Stewie someone who could. And that mystery loops back to the question of his relationship with Lois. In the early seasons, Stewie's central drive was the destruction of his mother. The specific and personal intensity of that drive, the way it took the form not just of abstract hostility but of elaborate schemes and sustained effort and genuine malice, has always raised the question of why. Why is it specifically Lois? Why is it specifically this relationship that produces this response? The show offered an answer in a later season episode, a conversation between Stewie and Lois in which Stewie explains, with unusual candor, that his early hostility toward her came from a sense of weakness that he found intolerable. She was responsible for him. He depended on her completely, and the dependence felt, from the inside, like a kind of imprisonment, a curtailment of the freedom and the autonomy that his intelligence told him he should have. The hostility was the rage of a person who knows who they are and cannot yet be that person because of the circumstances of their birth. This is actually a fairly profound piece of psychological writing for an animated comedy to land on, and it does not resolve the mystery of Stewie's early nature so much as add to it. If the hostility toward Lois was always about dependence and the rage of constrained potential, then the question of what produced that potential in the first place is even more pressing. The personality was there from the beginning. The capacity for this specific kind of rage, and this specific kind of scheming, and this specific kind of love, because underneath the rage there has always been a love that the show occasionally allows to surface, was there from the beginning. What made it? The show's universe does not say. And the bedroom laboratory, with its impossible contents, is the most visible evidence that whatever made Stewie is still at work, still producing outputs that exceed any reasonable accounting, still operating according to rules that the narrative has chosen not to expose. Extended section: The Mystery of Time Without Consequence. There is a scene that has never aired on Family Guy but that exists in the logical implications of the show's own structure. In this scene, Stewie and Brian are sitting in the living room or perhaps in Stewie's bedroom, and Brian turns to Stewie and says something like, "Do you ever think about everything that we have done?" Everything that we have changed and undone and witnessed and altered, do you ever think about the weight of all of it? This scene does not exist. It probably could not exist within the show's format, because the format cannot sustain that level of self-examination without abandoning the comedy that is its primary mode. But the question the scene would ask is one that the show's cosmology raises constantly without ever engaging with directly. Brian and Stewie have been through things that would be, in any universe governed by normal emotional physics, transformative. They have been to historical moments that carry enormous human weight. They have made choices that altered the course of events for people who never knew the alteration happened. They have watched each other through experiences of loss and recovery and loss again. They have been to the edge of existence and come back. And then the next episode, they are in the kitchen or in Stewie's room or on another road trip, and the weight of all of it is not there. Not because it has been processed and integrated and resolved, but because the format of the show does not carry weight forward. Each episode begins more or less clean. The characters carry their general personalities and their established relationships and their standing character notes, but they do not carry the specific accumulated gravity of what they have experienced together. This is the most fundamental mystery of the show's universe. Not what happened, but what it means that what happened does not seem to have mattered in the way that things that matter leave a mark. If you go through the things that Brian and Stewie have gone through together, you should be changed by them in ways that persist. The relationship should have a different quality at the end of Season 12 than it had at the end of Season 5. Not just in the surface way of having more shared history to reference, but in the deeper way of two people who have been through something genuinely difficult together and have been altered by it. Sometimes the show achieves this. There are moments, scattered across the later seasons, where the weight of the shared history is palpable between them, where the specificity of the relationship they have built over years of adventures and crises and recoveries is visible in the way they talk to each other. These moments are among the most emotionally resonant things the show has produced. They are also uncommon. The mystery of time without consequence is the mystery of what it means to love someone in a world where the evidence of that love does not accumulate. Where the relationship exists but the history of the relationship is always being partially erased. Where you can mean everything to someone and have been through everything with them and still face them in the next episode as if you are meeting them approximately fresh. This is not a mystery that the show will resolve. It is a condition of its existence. But it is worth naming, because it is the thing that makes the moments of genuine accumulated weight feel so powerful when they arrive. Against a background of reset and fresh start, the moments where the history actually shows through are extraordinary. They feel like something breaking through from a truer version of the story, a version where things that happened stayed happened, and people who were changed stayed changed. Those moments are what keep the people who have been watching longest still watching, the hope that another one is coming, that the true weight of 25 years of shared experience will surface one more time, will show through the format's resistance to it, will remind you of why you started watching in the first place. And when it does, it is worth every episode in between. Absolute end of script. Extended section. The mythology of Stewie and Lois. A war that quietly ended. There is a war in the Griffin household that most viewers of the show's later seasons may not even recognize as a war, because it ended so quietly and so gradually that the absence of it barely registered as an event. The war between Stewie Griffin and his mother Lois is one of the founding premises of the show, arguably the single most original and distinctive piece of creative territory that Family Guy claimed at the beginning of its run. A one-year-old baby who wants to kill his mother. Not in the abstract way of difficult family dynamics or complicated parental relationships, literally, with plans, with weapons, with the specific cold operational intensity of someone who has decided on a course of action and is working through the logistical steps required to execute it. This was unlike anything else on television at the time. It was unlike anything else that had been on television before it. The evil genius baby was a genuinely original character concept, and the comic engine it provided, the endless gap between what Stewie was and what a baby was supposed to be, between the violence of his intentions and the helplessness of his physical situation, was capable of producing an almost unlimited range of jokes and story possibilities. The premise was not a single joke. It was a premise, rich and expandable, pointing toward territory that the writers could have explored for many more seasons than they did. They did not explore it, they walked away from it. The decision to retire evil Stewie, To let the war with Lois quietly wind down across the middle seasons until it was no longer a meaningful part of his characterization was one of the most consequential creative choices the show made. And it remains mysterious, in the sense that the show never fully explained the internal logic of the change from Stewie's point of view. We have the external explanation. The writers felt the joke had run its course. Seth MacFarlane himself has said in interviews that they had taken the evil baby premise as far as it could go. This is the official account. But within the universe of the show, from Stewie's perspective, what happened? Why did he stop? The show gave one explanation, the conversation with Lois in a later episode about dependence and constrained potential, but this explanation describes the origin of the hostility rather than its resolution. It explains why the war began. It does not explain why it ended. There are several possible in-universe explanations that the show has never endorsed, but that the evidence supports to varying degrees. One is that Stewie's relationship with Brian changed him. The friendship with Brian gave Stewie something he did not have at the beginning: a genuine connection, a relationship of mutual recognition and affection that was not contingent on his performance as a villain or his execution of a plan. Being known by Brian and knowing Brian may have been the thing that made the obsessive focus on Lois less necessary as a project. When you have somewhere to put your energy and your intelligence and your love, the energy that was previously directed at destruction finds a different channel. Another possibility is that Stewie grew, not in the literal biological sense, since the show does not age its characters in any consistent way, but in the emotional and psychological sense, the sense that his experience of the world, accumulated across the episodes of the show, changed the shape of what he wanted. The child who built weapons to destroy his mother was operating from a position of pure, unmediated impulse, from the raw experience of a being who wanted something and was absolutely clear that the obstacle to that something was this specific woman. Experience changes this. Not always toward resolution, but sometimes. A third possibility, more uncomfortable, is that the show's writers simply lost interest in the premise and moved on without tracking what the change meant for the character's internal life. That the evil Stewie was retired, not because the story demanded it, but because the production machinery moved in a different direction, and nobody went back to check whether the change made sense for the person it had happened to. The mystery of the ended war is the mystery of what Stewie is now, in relation to what he was. He still has a relationship with Lois. It is warmer than it once was. There are genuine moments of connection between them that the early show would not have permitted. But the history of what he planned and almost did is still there, in the archive of the show, an early chapter in his story that the later chapters have not exactly resolved so much as moved past. What does Stewie think about who he used to be? The show has never asked this question. It has never shown Stewie looking back at the early seasons version of himself with any particular feeling. He has moved on, in the way that people move on from earlier versions of themselves, without full examination of what the earlier version was and what it meant, and whether something important was lost when it was set aside. The mystery of the ended war is finally the mystery of growth and its costs. When you become someone different, when you move from one identity to another, from evil genius to loyal friend and sometimes vulnerable companion, you leave something behind. The thing you leave behind was real. It was you. The show built something extraordinary in its early seasons and then quietly dismantled it, and the question of what was gained and what was lost in that dismantling is one that the show has never answered and probably cannot answer from where it currently stands. But it is worth asking. It is always worth asking what we were before we became who we are, and whether we are sure that who we are now is better, and what exactly we mean when we use the word better. Extended section. The mystery of what the show believes about love. Family Guy is, underneath everything else it is, a show about a marriage. Peter and Lois Griffin have been together for the entire run of the show, have loved and frustrated each other and forgiven each other, and occasionally descended into something less than love and come back out the other side. Their relationship is the structural center around which everything else in the show orbits, and the question of what the show believes about love, specifically about the kind of love that sustains a marriage across the entirety of an adult life, is one that the show has been exploring for 25 years, with results that are inconsistent and interesting and ultimately unresolved. The early seasons had a clarity about Peter and Lois that the later seasons have not always maintained. Peter loved Lois. This was simple and visible, and the show communicated it constantly, not through grand declarations but through the specific texture of their interactions, through the ways that Peter's recklessness always eventually circled back to the recognition that what he cared about most was her, through the apologies that the show allowed him to make and mean. The love was complicated and imperfect and sometimes eclipsed by his worst qualities. But it was there, structural, load-bearing, the thing that made the whole premise of the show feel like something other than cruelty. The later seasons lost some of this clarity. Peter's treatment of Lois became, in certain episodes, harder to square with any reading of the relationship that includes genuine love. And Lois's patience with Peter, which was always tested but always renewed in the early seasons, became in the later ones something more ambiguous, more suggestive of habit than of active choice. They stayed together the way people sometimes stay together, not because they are at every moment making the choice to stay, but because the alternative is a change of such magnitude that making the change seems harder than remaining. And yet the show still produces, with some regularity, episodes where Peter and Lois are undeniably good together, where something in their dynamic clicks into a register that is warm and funny and genuinely touching, where you can see why these two specific people, with all their differences and all the ways those differences produce friction, are better together than they would be apart. These moments are real. They are not concessions to sentimentality. They are evidence of a truth about the relationship that the show continues to understand even when it is not foregrounding it. The mystery of what the show believes about love is the mystery of whether Peter and Lois are an argument for love or a cautionary tale about it. Whether their 25 years together are presented as an achievement or as an ongoing, unresolved question about what people owe each other and what sustains them over time. The show does not commit to either reading. It oscillates between them, sometimes in the same episode, and the oscillation itself is the most honest thing it has to say on the subject. Love in the real world oscillates too. It is not always warm, and it is not always an active choice, and it is not always something you can describe to another person in a way that makes the case for it clearly. Sometimes it is simply the accumulated weight of time and shared experience, and the specific knowledge of another person that comes from proximity, from having been in the same house for long enough that you know how they sound when they are almost asleep, and what they look like in the morning before they are entirely themselves, and what they reach for first when something goes wrong. Peter and Lois have all of that. The show sometimes treats it as a joke, and sometimes treats it as a miracle, and mostly treats it as simply given, as the background condition of the story rather than the story itself. But it is the story. It has always been the story. Everything else, the cutaway gags and the adventures and the chicken fights and the time travel and the unsolved mysteries and the unanswered questions, everything is happening in the foreground of a love story that the show has been telling slowly and imperfectly and with great inconsistency for 25 years. And it is still going. Whatever it is that Peter and Lois have, it is still going. Which is its own kind of mystery. Which is, in the end, its own kind of answer.